Welcome, weary undead, to the dying embers of a world caught between flame and dark. Tonight, we explore the sacred bonds that bind souls together in Lordran's twilight. The covenants that offer purpose to the hollow, meaning to the lost, and brotherhood to those who wander alone through cursed lands. These are the oaths sworn in desperation and hope, the allegiances forged in the face of an inevitable end. So kindle your bonfire, let the flames dance gently in your vision, and allow your consciousness to drift as we walk together through the sacred halls of devotion, betrayal, and eternal duty. Rest now, chosen undead, and let these ancient stories carry you into peaceful slumber. In the ancient days when the flame burned bright and the gods walked among mortals with purpose and divine authority, there existed a covenant born from the purest intentions, yet destined to become one of the most corrupted institutions in all of Lordran. The Way of White emerged from the holy city of Thorolund, that distant land where golden spires reached toward heavens that still remembered the warmth of the first flame, where priests and clerics once communed with divinity itself through miracles that could heal the sick, mend the broken, and offer genuine salvation to souls lost in darkness. The Covenant's origins traced back to the teachings of All-Father Lloyd, that legendary figure whose very name had become synonymous with divine authority and righteous judgment throughout the known world. Lloyd was more than merely a religious leader or temporal ruler. He was the architect of a spiritual philosophy that sought to bring order and meaning to a world that had begun showing the first subtle signs of the decay that would eventually consume everything. His teachings spoke of the inherent nobility of the human spirit, the possibility of redemption even for the most fallen souls, and the sacred duty of the faithful to serve as beacons of hope in an increasingly uncertain age. Yet Lloyd's most significant contribution to the spiritual landscape of Lordran was not his philosophy alone, but his familial connection to the very gods themselves. As uncle to Lord Gwyn, the great Lord of Sunlight whose sacrifice had kindled the first flame and ushered in the Age of Fire, Lloyd possessed a legitimacy and authority that transcended mere mortal understanding. His words carried the weight of divine blood, his commands the force of celestial mandate, and his covenant the promise of connection to powers that existed beyond the comprehension of ordinary souls. The Way of White that emerged from Lloyd's teachings was intended to be humanity's bridge to the divine realm, a spiritual pathway that would allow mortal souls to commune with the gods and partake in their eternal wisdom. The Covenant's members were taught to see themselves as shepherds of divine will, protectors of the innocent, and guardians of the sacred truths that kept civilization bound together in harmony and purpose. They learned miracles that could heal wounds and restore life, mastered the arts of detecting and banishing the undead curse, and dedicated their existence to the service of something greater than their individual desires or fears. But even in those early days of apparent spiritual purity, the seeds of the Way of White's eventual corruption were already taking root in soil that seemed fertile with divine blessing. The Covenant's emphasis on hunting and destroying the undead, while born from genuine concern for the welfare of living souls, carried within it the potential for prejudice and cruelty that would eventually transform noble intentions into something far more sinister. The practitioners of Lloyd's teachings began to see themselves not merely as servants of divine will, but as judges of who deserved salvation and who merited destruction. The talismans that served as the focus for their miraculous powers became symbols not just of faith, but of authority over life and death itself. These sacred implements, blessed by divine energy and attuned to the spiritual frequencies that governed the flow of miraculous force, allowed their wielders to channel powers that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of mortal existence. Yet with such power came the inevitable temptation to use it, not merely in service of others, but in pursuit of personal glory and institutional dominance. As centuries passed and the first flame began its long, slow decline toward the inevitable twilight that would engulf all creation, the Way of White evolved from a covenant of genuine spiritual service into something that more closely resembled a political organization, masquerading as a religious institution. The pure teachings of All-Father Lloyd became increasingly interpreted through the lens of worldly concerns and temporal power, while the Covenant's members grew more concerned with maintaining their privileged position in society than with actually serving the spiritual needs of those who sought their guidance. The pilgrimage routes that had once been sacred journeys of spiritual discovery became highways of political influence and economic exploitation. The shrines and temples that had been built as sanctuaries for prayer and meditation were transformed into centers of bureaucratic administration and wealth accumulation. The miracles that had once been freely given to any soul in genuine need became commodities to be traded for political favor and material advantage. Perhaps nowhere was this corruption more evident than in the Covenant's relationship with the Princess Guard, that elite order of knights who had sworn themselves to the protection of Princess Guinevere, the daughter of Lord Gwyn, whose beauty and grace had become legendary throughout Lordran. The Princess Guard represented everything that the Way of White claimed to embody: devotion to divine authority, selfless service to something greater than oneself, and the willingness to sacrifice personal desires for the welfare of those under their protection. Yet the tragic irony that would define both Covenants' ultimate fate was already written in the fundamental deception upon which their devotion was based. The Princess Guinevere, whom the guards served with such unwavering loyalty, the divine figure whose very presence seemed to fill Anor Londo's great cathedral with warmth and light, was nothing more than an illusion created by her younger brother, Gwyndolin. The real Guinevere had long since departed from Lordran, fleeing the dying realm for distant lands where the fire still burned bright and the curse of undeath had not yet taken root. This deception, born from Gwyndolin's desperate desire to maintain hope and order in a world increasingly dominated by despair and chaos, would become the defining tragedy of both the Way of White and the Princess Guard. Those who served the illusory goddess did so with genuine faith and pure intentions, their devotion untainted by knowledge of the lie that formed the foundation of their spiritual lives. They offered their prayers to a divine presence that existed only in carefully maintained magical projection, sought blessings from a goddess who could no longer hear their pleas, and dedicated their lives to protecting someone who was no longer physically present in the realm they called home. The members of the Princess Guard who knelt before Guinevere's radiant form, offering their swords and their souls in service to divine beauty and grace, could never have imagined that they were actually pledging themselves to an elaborate fiction. Their faith was real, their commitment absolute, their willingness to die in defense of their goddess unquestionable. Yet the object of their devotion was as ephemeral as morning mist, as insubstantial as the dying light of the first flame itself. This fundamental dishonesty at the heart of both covenants would eventually poison everything they touched, transforming acts of genuine devotion into empty gestures and sincere faith into hollow ritual. The Way of White's missionaries who ventured forth into distant lands carrying Lloyd's teachings were unknowingly spreading a doctrine based on divine relationships that no longer truly existed. The Princess Guard's elite warriors, who trained for decades to perfect their protective techniques, were preparing to defend someone who was already beyond the reach of any earthly threat. As the Age of Fire drew toward its inevitable close and the undead curse began spreading throughout Lordran like a spiritual plague that no miracle could truly cure, both covenants found themselves facing challenges that their foundational deceptions had left them uniquely ill-equipped to handle. The Way of White's emphasis on hunting and destroying the undead became increasingly problematic, as more and more of their own members succumbed to the very curse they had been trained to eliminate in others. The covenant that had once stood as humanity's bulwark against the encroaching darkness of hollowing found itself forced to confront the terrible reality that their own spiritual leaders were not immune to the corruption they claimed to be able to cure. Clerics and bishops who had spent lifetimes perfecting the arts of undead detection and elimination discovered the distinctive brand of the dark sign appearing on their own flesh, marking them as carriers of the very curse they had devoted their existence to eradicating. This crisis of faith reached its most tragic expression in the pilgrimage of Rhea of Thorolund, that noble princess of the church whose journey to Lordran would serve as a microcosm of everything that had gone wrong with the Way of White's original mission. Rhea arrived in Lordran accompanied by her 3 loyal knights, Petrus of Thorolund, Vince of Thorolund, and Nico of Thorolund. Their small party, representing the Covenant's last desperate attempt to restore meaning and purpose to their increasingly hollow religious observances. The official purpose of Rhea's pilgrimage was to kindle the flames at Lordran's most sacred sites, performing rituals that would theoretically strengthen the spiritual bonds between the mortal and divine realms, while demonstrating the continued vitality of the Way of White's connection to celestial authority. Yet the deeper truth of her journey, known perhaps only to Rhea herself and the highest levels of the church hierarchy, was far more desperate and tragic than any public pronouncement could acknowledge. The princess had come to Lordran not as a triumphant representative of spiritual power, but as a refugee from a homeland that was slowly succumbing to the same spiritual decay that had already claimed so much of the known world. Thorolund itself, that golden city which had been the birthplace of Lloyd's teachings and the spiritual center of the Way of White, was beginning to show signs of the creeping corruption that preceded the arrival of the undead curse in any land fortunate enough to have avoided it thus far. Petrus of Thorolund, the knight who served as both protector and spiritual advisor to the young princess, carried within his heart secrets that would have shattered her faith had she been able to perceive them clearly. His devotion to the Way of White's teachings had long since curdled into cynicism and opportunism. His commitment to protecting Rhea's physical safety, compromised by his willingness to sacrifice her spiritual welfare for his own advancement within the Covenant's increasingly corrupt hierarchy. The other 2 knights, Vince and Nico, represented different aspects of the spiritual crisis that had engulfed their entire generation of clergy. Vince maintained the forms and rituals of faith while gradually losing connection to any genuine spiritual experience, his prayers becoming empty recitations and his miracles mere mechanical manipulations of divine energy. Nico struggled with doubts that he could never voice aloud, his loyalty to Rhea and the Covenant remaining strong, even as his certainty about the truth of their teachings slowly eroded like stone worn smooth by countless years of wind and rain. Together, this small band of pilgrims descended into the depths beneath Lordran, following ancient paths through the catacombs where the eternal dance of death and resurrection played out in endless cycles of horror and futility. Here, among the animated skeletons and tortured souls of the long dead, they hoped to find some remnant of the divine presence that had once made their faith meaningful and their service genuinely beneficial to the world. Instead, they discovered only deeper layers of deception and corruption. The sacred flames they had come to kindle burned with false light, their warmth providing no real comfort, and their illumination revealing only more shadows. The miracles they performed in these cursed depths felt hollow and mechanical, their healing power diminished, and their capacity to inspire hope reduced to mere theatre for an audience of the already damned. The tragedy of Rhea's pilgrimage would reach its culmination in betrayal and murder, as Petrus's long-hidden corruption finally revealed itself in acts of violence that destroyed not only the princess's life, but also any remaining pretense that the Way of White retained any connection to its original noble purposes. The knight who had sworn to protect her would become her destroyer, his crime serving as a perfect metaphor for what the Covenant itself had become, an institution that killed the very thing it claimed to protect. Yet even this betrayal was not the end of the Way of White's spiritual decay. The Covenant would continue to exist, its members continuing to perform the rituals and recite the prayers that had once connected them to divine purpose. But their actions would become increasingly empty of genuine spiritual content. They would hunt undead not from conviction but from habit, offer healing not from compassion but from institutional obligation, and speak of divine will not from faith but from the momentum of centuries of spiritual bureaucracy. The Princess Guard, meanwhile, would maintain their vigil before Guinevere's illusory form with devotion that was both admirable and heartbreaking in its futility. These elite warriors, trained to perceive threats that might endanger their goddess and respond with lightning-quick precision to neutralize any danger, could not defend against the one enemy that actually threatened her: the gradual fading of the magical energies that maintained her false existence. As Gwyndolin's power waned with the dying of the first flame, the illusion of his sister would become increasingly difficult to maintain. The radiant beauty that had inspired countless souls to devotion would flicker and fade like a candle in a hurricane wind, while the divine presence that had seemed so real and comforting would reveal itself as nothing more than clever manipulation of light and shadow. The guards who witnessed this gradual dissolution of everything they had devoted their lives to protecting would face a choice that no warrior should ever be forced to make: acknowledge the fundamental lie that had shaped their entire existence, or retreat into denial and madness rather than confront the unbearable truth of their situation. Some would choose the former path, abandoning their posts and their faith to seek some new meaning in a world that had revealed itself to be far stranger and more deceptive than they had ever imagined. Others would choose the latter, maintaining their vigil even after the illusion had completely faded, standing guard over empty air and offering their prayers to a void that could never respond with anything but silence. These faithful guardians, driven mad by the collapse of their fundamental beliefs, yet unable to abandon the duties that had defined their lives, would become living symbols of the tragic fate that awaited any institution built upon foundations of deliberate deception. The final irony of both Covenants' fate was that their corruption and ultimate failure would serve a purpose that their founders could never have intended or anticipated. By becoming examples of what happened when spiritual organizations lost connection to genuine divine truth, they would provide future generations with cautionary tales about the dangers of allowing political expedience and worldly concerns to override authentic spiritual experience. The Way of White's transformation from a genuine force for healing and hope into a corrupt bureaucracy obsessed with power and control would demonstrate the inevitable fate of any religious institution that prioritized temporal authority over spiritual service. The Princess Guard's devotion to an illusory goddess would illustrate the tragic consequences of building one's entire sense of meaning and purpose upon foundations that could not withstand honest scrutiny. Yet perhaps there was a kind of redemption even in this failure, a spiritual lesson embedded in the very tragedy of their corruption. For those with eyes to see and hearts to understand, the fate of these covenants would serve as a reminder that true spiritual connection cannot be maintained through institutional structures alone. That authentic divine relationship requires personal commitment and individual faith that transcends any external organization or temporal authority. The undead who encountered the remnants of these fallen covenants in Lordran's twilight years would be forced to grapple with questions that went to the very heart of what it meant to seek meaning and purpose in a world that seemed increasingly devoid of both. They would see in the Way of White's corruption and the Princess Guard's futile devotion reflections of their own struggles to maintain hope and direction in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles and unavoidable decay. And perhaps, in recognizing these reflections, they would find the wisdom to forge their own paths toward whatever transcendence might still be possible in a world where the gods had fled, the flame was dying, and the only certainties were the endless cycles of death and rebirth that defined existence for all who bore the curse of undeath. In the heart of Lordran's fading majesty, where the light of the first flame cast its last golden rays across ancient stones worn smooth by countless ages of devotion and despair, there existed two covenants that embodied the eternal struggle between cooperation and vengeance, between the warm embrace of fellowship and the cold satisfaction of divine justice. These were the warriors of sunlight and the blade of the dark moon, twin expressions of humanity's deepest needs. The desire to stand together against overwhelming darkness, and the equally powerful urge to see wrongdoing punished with swift and merciless retribution. The warriors of sunlight emerged from the teachings and example of one whose very presence seemed to kindle hope in the hearts of even the most hollow and despairing souls. Solaire of Astora, that legendary knight whose golden armor caught and reflected light as if he were a living embodiment of the sun itself, had discovered in his wanderings through cursed lands a philosophy so simple and yet so profound that it would reshape the very nature of how undead souls related to one another in their shared struggle against inevitable doom. Jolly cooperation. These two words, spoken by Solaire with such genuine warmth and enthusiasm that they seemed to carry their own illumination, became more than merely a tactical philosophy or strategic approach to survival in hostile territory. They represented a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be undead in a world that had seemingly abandoned all hope of redemption or transcendence. Where others saw only competition for scarce resources and opportunities, Solaire perceived possibilities for mutual aid and shared triumph that could transform even the most desperate circumstances into occasions for joy and camaraderie. The knight's own origins remained shrouded in mystery even to those who knew him best, his past as carefully concealed as his true identity beneath the brilliant facade of optimism and dedication to cooperative principles. Some whispered that he was a prince or nobleman from the distant land of Astora. Others suggested he might be a former cleric who had abandoned traditional religious observance in favor of a more direct and personal approach to spiritual practice. Yet these speculations mattered far less than the undeniable impact of his presence and teachings upon every soul fortunate enough to encounter him during their own dark journeys through Lordran's cursed landscape. Solaire's approach to the challenges of undead existence was revolutionary in its simplicity and radical in its implications for how cursed souls might relate to one another. Rather than viewing other undead as competitors or threats, he saw them as potential allies, whose unique skills and perspectives could complement his own abilities in ways that made previously impossible achievements suddenly within reach. His philosophy suggested that the greatest victories were not those won through individual prowess or solitary determination, but rather those accomplished through the careful coordination of diverse talents working in perfect harmony toward shared objectives. The covenant that formed around these principles attracted souls who had grown weary of the isolation and paranoia that characterized so much of undead existence. Warriors who had spent decades perfecting their combat techniques in solitude discovered the joy of sharing their knowledge with others, while simultaneously learning from companions whose approaches to similar challenges offered new insights and possibilities. Sorcerers who had jealously guarded their arcane secrets found themselves teaching spells and sharing research with fellow Covenant members. Their own understanding deepened and expanded through the process of explanation and collaborative experimentation. Yet the Warriors of Sunlight represented more than merely a mutual aid society for undead adventurers seeking to improve their odds of survival in hostile territory. The Covenant's emphasis on cooperation and shared achievement reflected deeper spiritual principles that challenged the fundamental assumptions about heroism and individual glory that had dominated warrior culture throughout the Age of Fire. Solaire's teachings suggested that true strength came not from the ability to stand alone against overwhelming odds, but from the wisdom to recognize when collaboration could achieve outcomes that no individual effort, however heroic, could hope to accomplish. The golden phantoms that appeared when Covenant members answered calls for assistance became symbols of hope that transcended their immediate tactical utility. These shimmering manifestations of cooperative spirit, visible to those who kindled their humanity and opened their hearts to the possibility of aid from unexpected sources, represented the physical embodiment of Solaire's philosophy made manifest in the world. When a struggling undead witnessed the appearance of a golden phantom ready to offer assistance without expectation of personal reward, they experienced firsthand the transformative power of genuine altruism in a realm where such selflessness had become almost unimaginably rare. The Covenant's signature gesture, the praising of the sun with arms raised toward the heavens in a pose of joyful reverence, became more than merely a form of greeting or identification among members. This simple act served as a constant reminder of the light that still existed in a world increasingly dominated by shadow, a physical affirmation of faith in the possibility that cooperation and goodwill could triumph over the forces of despair and isolation that sought to hollow every soul and reduce all existence to meaningless struggle for temporary advantage. Yet, even as the Warriors of Sunlight celebrated the power of cooperation and mutual aid, their very existence served to highlight the tragic irony that lay at the heart of Solaire's own personal quest. The knight who had become the living embodiment of collaborative achievement and shared triumph was himself searching for something that could only be found through individual spiritual revelation, his own sun, that perfect source of illumination and meaning that would complete his understanding of his place in the cosmic order. This paradox would ultimately lead to Solaire's most tragic moment, when his desperate search for personal enlightenment would drive him toward the very madness he had helped others avoid through the power of fellowship and cooperation. The sunlight maggot that he would eventually mistake for his long-sought sun represented the dark shadow that followed even the brightest examples of spiritual dedication. The reminder that no philosophy, however noble, could completely protect its adherents from the fundamental challenges of existence in a cursed world. The Covenant's connection to Gwyn's lost firstborn added layers of complexity and tragedy to its foundational principles that few members ever fully understood. This nameless deity, stripped of official recognition and erased from historical records for transgressions that remained mysterious, even to scholars who had spent lifetimes studying the genealogies and political relationships among Lordran's ruling. Banteon had once served as patron of war and military achievement before his exile from the official pantheon of recognized gods. The transformation of this exiled war god into the patron of cooperative combat and mutual aid represented one of the most profound spiritual evolutions in all of Lordran's religious history. Where once this deity had inspired individual warriors to seek personal glory and domination over their enemies, his exile and subsequent spiritual development had led to a completely reimagined understanding of what true strength and victory might mean in practice. The lightning spear miracles that served as the Covenant's signature combat techniques carried within their crackling energy the transformed wisdom of a god who had learned through suffering and loss that the greatest power came not from the ability to strike down enemies single-handedly, but from the capacity to inspire others to achieve their highest potential through collaborative effort. When Covenant members hurled these bolts of divine electricity at their foes, they were channeling not merely destructive force, but the accumulated wisdom of a deity who had discovered that true godhood lay not in domination, but in service. Standing in stark contrast to the warm fellowship of the warriors of sunlight was the cold and terrible justice embodied by the blade of the dark moon, that covenant born from the righteous fury of Gwyndolin, the dark sun who ruled over Anor Londo's empty halls, with a mixture of divine authority and profound personal anguish, where Solaire's covenant celebrated cooperation and mutual aid. Gwyndolin's followers dedicated themselves to the pursuit and punishment of those who had violated the sacred trusts that bound civilized society together. Gwyndolin himself represented one of the most complex and tragic figures in all of Lordran's pantheon, a deity whose very existence challenged conventional understanding of divine nature and purpose. Born with an affinity for the moon rather than the sun that his father Gwyn embodied, raised with feminine characteristics despite his masculine divine essence, Gwyndolin occupied a liminal space between traditional categories that made him uniquely suited to understand the subtle complexities of justice and moral judgment. The Dark Sun's rule over Anor Londo had begun as a desperate attempt to maintain order and hope in a realm abandoned by its other divine inhabitants, but it had gradually evolved into something far more sophisticated and morally complex. His creation of the Princess Guinevere illusion, while fundamentally deceptive, was born from genuine compassion for souls who needed something beautiful and hopeful to believe in during their darkest moments. Yet this same capacity for necessary deception made him acutely aware of the damage that lies and betrayals could inflict upon the social fabric that held communities together. The blade of the Dark Moon Covenant emerged from Gwyndolin's recognition that mercy and forgiveness, while admirable qualities in many circumstances, were insufficient responses to the kinds of deliberate cruelty and betrayal that threatened to destroy the very possibility of trust and cooperation among thinking beings. His followers, known as Dark Moon Blades, served as instruments of divine vengeance against those who had committed sins so egregious that they could not be forgiven through ordinary means. The blue phantoms that manifested when Covenant members answered the call to punish sinners represented a very different kind of spiritual intervention than the golden cooperation offered by the Warriors of Sunlight, where Solaire's followers appeared to offer assistance and support. The Dark Moon Blades materialized as agents of retribution, their presence serving as a reminder that actions had consequences, and that some violations of moral order demanded swift and decisive punishment. The Covenant's emphasis on hunting and destroying those who had been marked as sinners created a complex moral landscape that challenged simple distinctions between good and evil, justice and cruelty. The Book of the Guilty, maintained by Oswald of Karim, served as the Covenant's primary source of targets, listing those who had committed acts of betrayal, murder, or violation of sanctuary that demanded supernatural intervention. Yet the process by which souls were added to this book was itself morally ambiguous, dependent upon the testimony of victims and witnesses whose own motivations and reliability could never be completely verified. Dark Moon Nightess, that devoted follower who served as Gwyndolin's primary representative in interactions with potential Covenant members, embodied both the nobility and the tragedy inherent in dedicated service to abstract principles of justice. Her unwavering loyalty to the Dark Sun and absolute commitment to carrying out his will in matters of divine retribution made her a figure of both admiration and pity, admirable for her perfect dedication to duty, pitiable for the isolation that such single-minded devotion inevitably created. The firekeeper's role in maintaining the bonfire at the Ainur Londo Cathedral created additional layers of symbolic meaning within the Covenant's spiritual framework. Here was someone who tended the physical flame that provided comfort and respite to weary travelers, while simultaneously serving the dark sun, whose justice could be as harsh and unforgiving as winter moonlight on fresh snow. This dual nature, nurturing and punitive, protective and threatening, reflected the fundamental complexity of justice itself as a moral concept. The Covenant's signature miracles, particularly the Dark Moon Blade enchantment that imbued weapons with the pale light of lunar judgment, carried within their ethereal glow the accumulated weight of centuries of moral decisions and divine pronouncements. When a Dark Moon Blade wielded a weapon blessed with this enchantment, they were channeling not merely magical energy, but the distilled essence of divine justice refined through countless individual cases and moral determinations. Yet the very existence of the Blade of the Dark Moon Covenant raised profound questions about the nature of justice and the proper role of divine intervention in mortal affairs. The Covenant's members served as judge, jury, and executioner for those marked as sinners, operating according to moral standards and evidentiary requirements that were never fully explained or publicly debated. This concentration of judicial authority in the hands of beings who answered to no earthly court or democratic institution created possibilities for abuse and error that troubled thoughtful observers who supported the Covenant's general principles while questioning its specific methods. The relationship between individual Dark Moon Blades and their targets created additional moral complexity that challenged simple narratives about heroic justice and villainous wrongdoing. The souls marked for punishment by Gwendolyn's Covenant were themselves undead beings struggling with the same existential challenges and moral temptations that faced every cursed individual in Lordran. Their sins, however egregious, were often born from desperation, fear, or the kind of gradual moral erosion that characterized the hollowing process itself. The Blue Phantom who materialized to punish a sinner might find themselves facing not a cackling villain who gloried in evil for its own sake, but rather a hollow shell of a former person whose capacity for moral reasoning had been worn away by centuries of suffering and repeated death. The justice being administered in such cases became less a matter of punishment-fitting crime and more a form of mercy-killing, putting an end to a form of existence that had become unbearable for all involved. The Covenant's connection to Oswald of Karim, that mysterious pardoner who served as both confessor and intelligence gatherer for the forces of divine justice, added another layer of moral ambiguity to the entire enterprise. Oswald's role in absolving sins and removing souls from the Book of the Guilty suggested that redemption remained possible, even for those who had committed acts serious enough to warrant supernatural punishment. Yet his secretive methods and ambiguous loyalties raised questions about whether he served justice or merely maintained the administrative apparatus that made the Covenant's operations possible. The Velka connection that some scholars detected in the Covenant's practices introduced additional complexity regarding the true source of the moral authority that Dark Moon Blades claimed to represent. The goddess of sin, whose worship had been driven underground but never completely eliminated, represented an alternative understanding of justice that emphasized personal responsibility and direct consequences for moral choices. If Gwendolyn's Covenant was indeed connected to Velka's surviving influence, then the Dark Moon Blades might be serving not the Dark Sun's personal vision of justice, but rather a more ancient and fundamental cosmic principle that transcended any individual deity's preferences or prejudices. The Covenant's recruitment practices reflected the moral complexity that characterized all aspects of its operations. Unlike the warriors of sunlight, whose membership was open to any soul willing to embrace the principles of cooperation and mutual aid. The Blade of the Dark Moon demanded evidence of moral commitment and spiritual development that could only be demonstrated through specific actions and achievements. Potential members needed to prove their dedication to justice through deeds rather than mere words, their understanding of moral complexity through successful navigation of ambiguous ethical situations. This selective approach to membership created a covenant composed of individuals who had already wrestled with fundamental questions about right and wrong, justice and mercy, individual responsibility, and collective obligation. The Dark Moon Blades were not simply warriors seeking purpose or adventure, but rather souls who had chosen to dedicate their existence to the pursuit of abstract moral principles, even when such dedication required personal sacrifice and spiritual isolation. The relationship between the Warriors of Sunlight and the Blade of the Dark Moon reflected broader tensions within the spiritual landscape of Lordran, between different approaches to the fundamental challenges of undead existence. Solaire's followers represented the possibility that cooperation and goodwill could create islands of hope and meaning in an ocean of despair, while Gwyndolin's servants argued that such islands could only be preserved through the active elimination of those who would destroy them through betrayal and deliberate cruelty. Both covenants shared the fundamental belief that individual actions mattered, and that undead souls retained the capacity for moral choice even in the face of the hollowing curse. Where they differed was in their understanding of how best to nurture and protect that capacity, through positive reinforcement and supportive community, or through negative consequences and deterrent punishment. This philosophical divide created practical tensions that played out in the daily interactions between Covenant members who encountered each other in their travels through Lordran's dangerous territories. The irony that both covenants ultimately served gods who were themselves morally compromised or spiritually wounded added another layer of complexity to their philosophical rivalry. Solaire's son, assuming it was indeed connected to Gwyn's lost firstborn, represented a deity who had been cast out for unknown transgressions and who had transformed his understanding of power and authority through the experience of exile and suffering. Gwyndolin's rule over Aenor Londo was founded upon the necessary deception of the Guinevere illusion, a lie told in service of what he believed to be greater truths about hope and meaning. Neither covenant could claim to serve a morally perfect divine authority whose commands could be followed without question or doubt. Instead, both groups of followers had to navigate the complex reality of serving deities who were themselves struggling with fundamental questions about right and wrong, truth and deception, individual needs, and collective welfare. This shared uncertainty about ultimate moral authority created opportunities for dialogue and mutual understanding between covenant members who might otherwise have seen each other as representatives of incompatible philosophical systems. The practical effects of both covenants' activities upon the broader community of undead souls in Lordran demonstrated the ways in which abstract philosophical principles translated into concrete improvements or complications in daily existence. The Warriors of Sunlight's emphasis on cooperation created networks of mutual aid that allowed individual undead to accomplish objectives that would have been impossible through solitary effort. Ancient ruins were explored, dangerous enemies defeated, and valuable resources recovered through collaborative expeditions that distributed both risks and rewards among all participants. The Blade of the Dark Moon's pursuit of divine justice created a deterrent effect that discouraged the kinds of predatory behavior and deliberate cruelty that could make travel through hostile territory even more dangerous than it needed to be. Souls who might otherwise have been tempted to prey upon weaker individuals or violate sanctuary agreements found themselves reconsidering such actions when they understood that supernatural punishment might follow their transgressions. Yet both covenants also created their own forms of moral hazard and unintended consequences that complicated their positive contributions to community welfare. The Warriors of Sunlight's emphasis on cooperation could lead to dependency relationships where weaker souls never developed the individual skills and spiritual resilience necessary for long-term survival. The Blade of the Dark Moon's pursuit of justice could escalate into cycles of revenge and counter-revenge that ultimately harmed the very communities the Covenant claimed to protect. The ultimate legacy of both covenants would be measured not merely by their immediate practical effects, but by their contribution to the ongoing conversation about how conscious beings ought to relate to one another in circumstances of extreme adversity and moral uncertainty. The Warriors of Sunlight offered proof that cooperation and mutual aid remained possible even when individual survival seemed to depend upon competition and selfishness. The Blade of the Dark Moon demonstrated that moral standards and accountability could be maintained even when traditional legal and social institutions had collapsed or become corrupted. Together, these two covenants represented complementary aspects of humanity's response to existential crisis, the impulse toward unity and mutual support, balanced by the recognition that such unity could only be preserved through the active defense of moral boundaries and the punishment of those who violated them. Their ongoing tension and occasional cooperation reflected the eternal challenge of creating and maintaining communities based on shared values, while remaining realistic about the moral limitations and potential for corruption that characterized all conscious beings, whether mortal or divine. In the end, both the golden light of jolly cooperation and the pale glow of divine justice served as beacons of hope for souls navigating the darkness of Lordran's twilight age, reminders that meaning and purpose could still be found, even when the fundamental structures of reality seemed to be crumbling into chaos and despair. Whether through the warm embrace of fellowship or the cold comfort of moral certainty, both covenants offered their members ways of transcending the isolation and nihilism that threatened to consume all who bore the curse of undeath in a world where gods had fled and flames were dying. In the deepest shadows of Lordran's ancient wilderness, where twisted roots drink from soil enriched by countless ages of death and decay, there existed covenants born from humanity's most primal relationships with the natural world and the terrible forces that governed life, death, and the spaces between them. The Forest Hunter Covenant and the Chaos Servant Covenant represented two faces of the same fundamental truth, that civilization's carefully constructed boundaries meant nothing to the older powers that had shaped the world long before the gods kindled their first flames or mortals learned to speak the names of their creators. The Forest Hunter Covenant emerged from the sacred groves where Alvina, that ancient and enigmatic feline whose wisdom predated the rise of kingdoms and the fall of dragons, maintained her eternal vigil over mysteries that mortal minds could barely comprehend. This was no ordinary cat. Despite her deceptively domestic appearance and her tendency to engage visitors in conversations that seemed almost casual until one realized the profound implications of the knowledge she so casually dispensed. Alvina was a creature of the deep woods, a guardian spirit whose connection to the primordial forces that had shaped Darkroot Garden ran deeper than the oldest trees and stronger than the most ancient stones. The forest she protected was itself a monument to tragedy and loss on a scale that dwarfed the petty concerns of human kingdoms and divine politics. Here, in groves where sunlight filtered through leaves that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, lay the grave of Knight Artorius, the Abyss Walker, that legendary hero whose name had once been spoken with reverence throughout every corner of the known world. Artorias had been more than merely a skilled warrior or devoted knight. He had been the embodiment of humanity's highest aspirations, a figure whose courage and dedication to protecting the innocent had made him seem almost divine in the eyes of those who heard tales of his legendary deeds. Yet for all his legendary prowess and unwavering moral commitment, Artorias had ultimately fallen not to any earthly enemy but to the abyss itself, that primordial darkness which existed beyond good and evil, beyond light and shadow, beyond any of the comfortable categories that conscious beings use to make sense of their existence. His corruption and eventual defeat at the hands of the very force he had sworn to oppose served as a constant reminder that even the greatest heroes were ultimately mortal, ultimately limited, ultimately vulnerable to forces that transcended their understanding and their ability to resist. The great wolf Sif, who maintained her eternal vigil beside Artorias' grave with a devotion that had endured long past the point where memory might have faded or grief might have lessened, represented loyalty transformed into something approaching the sacred. This massive creature, whose size and ferocity made her a formidable guardian against any who might disturb the night's rest, was more than merely a beast mourning her fallen master. She was the living embodiment of the bond between warrior and companion, a relationship so deep and fundamental that it had transcended death itself, to become a force of nature in its own right. Sif's protection of the grave extended beyond mere sentiment or emotional attachment to encompass a deeper understanding of what Artorias had represented and why his memory deserved to be preserved inviolate. The knight had not merely been an individual hero whose personal story deserved remembrance, but rather a symbol of the possibility that conscious beings could choose to stand against overwhelming darkness, even when victory seemed impossible and survival unlikely. His grave had become a shrine not just to his personal courage, but to the very idea that moral choice retained meaning even in the face of cosmic indifference. The covenant of Artorias that bore the knight's name and carried his spiritual legacy represented more than simply a piece of magical jewelry or protective talisman. This legendary ring embodied the accumulated wisdom and spiritual strength that Artorias had developed through his battles against the forces of chaos and corruption, a legacy that could protect its bearer from the very abyss that had ultimately claimed its creator. The covenant served as both memorial and practical tool, ensuring that the knight's sacrifice would continue to serve the cause of protecting innocent souls, long after his physical death had ended his direct participation in the struggle between light and darkness. Alvina's role as the protector of this sacred space and the covenant that grew around it reflected her deep understanding of the interconnectedness between natural cycles and moral responsibility. The forest she guarded was not merely a collection of trees and wildlife, but rather a living ecosystem where every element played its part in maintaining the delicate balance between growth and decay, life and death, preservation and transformation. The hunters who joined her covenant were not simply warriors defending territory, but rather participants in an ancient ritual of guardianship that connected them to forces far older and more fundamental than any human institution. The Covenant's emphasis on defending the forest against intruders who sought to exploit its resources or disturb its sacred sites reflected a deeper philosophical understanding of the relationship between civilization and wilderness. The hunters who answered Alvina's call were not motivated by simple xenophobia or territorial aggression, but rather by the recognition that some places and some knowledge were too precious and too dangerous to be exposed to the casual violence and thoughtless exploitation that characterized so much of human interaction with the natural world. The invasion mechanics that allowed Covenant members to enter the worlds of those who trespassed in their sacred groves served as more than merely a gameplay feature or competitive challenge. These spiritual interventions represented the forest's own immune response to contamination, the natural world's way of defending itself against those who would treat sacred spaces as mere hunting grounds or sources of material wealth. When a forest hunter appeared to challenge an intruder, they were serving as the conscious agent of forces that would otherwise express themselves through more gradual but equally inexorable processes of natural consequence. The tragedy of Ulasil, that ancient kingdom whose fate had become inextricably linked with the forest's history and Artorius's ultimate downfall, cast a shadow over the entire Covenant's understanding of its mission and responsibilities. This once great civilization had been destroyed, not through external conquest or natural disaster, but through its own curiosity and ambition. Its scholars and sorcerers delving too deeply into mysteries that human minds were not equipped to safely comprehend. The abyss that had consumed Ulasil and corrupted Artorius was not simply another enemy to be fought and defeated, but rather a fundamental aspect of reality itself, the primordial darkness from which all things had emerged, and to which all things would eventually return. The kingdom's attempts to study and harness this force for their own purposes had been doomed from the very beginning, not because they lacked sufficient knowledge or skill, but because the very act of trying to comprehend the incomprehensible inevitably led to corruption and madness. The sorceries and magical techniques that had been developed by Ulasil's scholars before their civilization's fall represented some of the most powerful and dangerous knowledge ever accumulated by mortal minds. These spells, which manipulated light and darkness with unprecedented precision and effectiveness, carried within them the seeds of the very corruption that had destroyed their creators. The few surviving examples of Ulasilian magic served as both invaluable tools for those brave enough to wield them and constant reminders of the price that could be exacted for hubris and intellectual overreach. Princess Dusk, the sole known survivor of Ulasil's destruction, existed in a state that challenged conventional understanding of life and death, presence and absence, memory and forgetting. Her crystalline form, suspended in a twilight existence between worlds, served as both a living memorial to her lost kingdom and a warning about the consequences of delving too deeply into forces beyond mortal comprehension. Those who encountered her were granted access to some of the lost kingdom's magical knowledge, but always with the implicit understanding that such power came with risks that could never be completely mitigated or controlled. The relationship between the Forest Hunter Covenant and the broader community of undead souls in Lordran reflected the complex tensions between preservation and accessibility, protection and isolation that characterized all attempts to safeguard valuable knowledge or sacred sites. The hunters' aggressive defense of their territory could be seen as necessary guardianship of irreplaceable spiritual resources, or alternatively as selfish hoarding of wisdom and power that might benefit the broader community if shared more freely. The red phantoms that manifested when Covenant members invaded the worlds of forest trespassers carried within their crimson glow all the accumulated anger and protective instinct of those who had chosen to dedicate their existence to defending something they considered more precious than their own lives. These were not random acts of violence or simple expressions of territorial aggression, but rather ritualized confrontations that served to determine whether intruders possessed the strength, skill, and moral commitment necessary to safely interact with the forces they sought to encounter. Standing in stark contrast to the ancient natural wisdom represented by the forest hunters was the Chaos Servant Covenant, born from humanity's most catastrophic attempt to manipulate the fundamental forces of creation itself. The Witch of Izalith, whose name had once been spoken with reverence as one of the great lords who had challenged the dominion of the ancient dragons, had become, through her own tragic choices, the mother of demons, and the architect of one of the most devastating disasters in all of recorded history. The first flame, that cosmic fire which had brought light and warmth to a world previously dominated by eternal twilight and the stone-scaled tyranny of the everlasting dragons, was not merely a source of energy or illumination, but rather the fundamental organizing principle around which all of reality had restructured itself. When this flame began to fade, as all fires must eventually fade, the very foundations of existence started to crumble and shift in ways that threatened to return the world to the grey formlessness that had preceded the Age of Fire. The witch's attempt to recreate the first flame through her own magical arts was born from the noblest of intentions and the deepest understanding of what its loss would mean for all conscious life. She had witnessed the gradual decline of the flame's power, had seen the first signs of the decay and corruption that would eventually transform Lordran into a realm of undead wanderers and hollow kingdoms. Her decision to risk everything in an attempt to rekindle the cosmic fire represented not hubris or selfishness, but rather the desperate courage of someone willing to sacrifice herself for the welfare of all existence. Yet the chaos flame that resulted from her failed experiment was not a recreation of the original fire, but rather something entirely new and terrifyingly unpredictable. This twisted creation burned not with the steady, life-giving warmth that had characterized the first flame, but with a wild and consuming hunger that transformed everything it touched into grotesque parodies of their original forms. The demons that emerged from the witch's transformed body were not evil in any conventional sense, but rather expressions of creative force run completely wild, life energy freed from all the careful constraints and balances that had previously kept it from consuming everything in its path. The fair lady, the witch's daughter who had been closest to her mother during the failed experiment, and who had consequently absorbed more of the chaos flame's corrupting influence than any other member of their family, represented tragedy on a scale that transcended individual suffering to become a symbol of the price that could be exacted for even the most well-intentioned attempts to reshape the fundamental order of reality. Her transformation into a barely recognizable mass of corrupted flesh and demonic appendages would have been heartbreaking enough as a personal tragedy, but the fact that she retained her human consciousness and capacity for love throughout her physical degradation elevated her suffering to something approaching the sublime. The covenant that formed around the fair lady's desperate need for humanity to sustain her existence and alleviate her constant agony attracted souls who understood that some forms of service transcended rational calculation of personal benefit or strategic advantage. The Chaos Servants, who offered their precious humanity to feed the dying demon sister, were not motivated by hope of reward or fear of punishment, but rather by the simple recognition that her suffering was unbearable and that they possessed the power to provide at least temporary relief. Kirk, Knight of Thorns, exemplified both the nobility and the tragedy inherent in complete devotion to the fair lady's welfare. This legendary warrior, whose prowess in combat had made his name feared throughout Lordran, had abandoned all other pursuits and considerations to dedicate his existence entirely to gathering the humanity that could ease his beloved's constant pain. His invasion of other undead souls' worlds was not motivated by cruelty or sadistic pleasure, but rather by the desperate love of someone willing to become a monster himself, if that was the price required to help the one person he sees, cared about more than his own moral status or spiritual welfare. The irony that Kirk's devotion led him to commit acts that would normally be considered evil or selfish reflected the moral complexity that characterized the entire Chaos Servant Covenant. The humanity that could alleviate the fair lady's suffering was not an abstract resource that could be manufactured or discovered in hidden caches, but rather the very essence of other conscious beings' capacity for hope, love, and meaningful choice. To gather enough humanity to make a significant difference in the fair lady's condition required either the cooperation of other souls who freely chose to share their most precious possession, or the violent extraction of that essence from those who would not give it willingly. This fundamental moral dilemma created a covenant membership that included both the most altruistic and the most ruthlessly pragmatic souls in all of Lordran. Some Chaos servants, like Kirk himself, had made peace with the necessity of committing acts they would normally consider abhorrent in service of what they believed to be a greater good. Others sought to find ways of gathering humanity through cooperation and voluntary exchange, offering their own skills and knowledge in return for donations from those who could spare some of their precious essence without significantly compromising their own spiritual welfare. Quelana of Izalith, the witch's daughter, who had escaped the worst effects of the Chaos Flame's corruption through her physical absence during the critical moments of the experiment, carried within her heart a burden of guilt and responsibility that had shaped every aspect of her existence for centuries following her mother's transformation. Her decision to teach pyromancy to worthy students represented both an attempt at atonement for her family's catastrophic mistake and a practical effort to ensure that the knowledge necessary to contain and control chaotic fire would not be lost when the last members of her family finally succumbed to their corruption. The pyromantic arts that Quelana taught were not merely combat techniques or practical applications of magical theory, but rather philosophical and spiritual disciplines that required practitioners to understand and accept the fundamental unpredictability of fire as a creative and destructive force. The flames that pyromancers learned to summon and direct were not domesticated tools that could be controlled through simple application of will or technique, but rather wild forces that retained their capacity for autonomous action and unexpected behavior, even when channeled through the most skillful and experienced practitioners. The relationship between pyromancy and the chaos flame that had destroyed Quelana's family served as a constant reminder of the fine line that separated beneficial magical practice from catastrophic overreach. Every spell cast, every flame summoned, every application of fire magic carried within it the potential for the kind of chain reaction that had transformed the Witch of Izalith from a benevolent lord into the bed of chaos. This awareness of inherent danger made pyromancy a discipline that attracted only those souls who possessed both the courage to work with forces beyond their complete control and the wisdom to recognize the limits of their own. Understanding the tragic fate of the witch's other children, transformed into demons of various sizes and dispositions by the chaotic energies that had consumed their mother, illustrated the way that even the closest family bonds could be corrupted and twisted by exposure to forces that operated according to principles fundamentally alien to conscious moral choice. The centipede demon, the demon fire sage, and the countless lesser demons that had emerged from the chaos served as both guardians of their transformed mother and obstacles that prevented most souls from ever approaching close enough to understand the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen Izalith. Yet even in their transformed states, these demon children retained enough of their original nature to suggest that consciousness and choice persisted, even after physical form had been completely reconstructed according to chaotic principles. The protective instincts they displayed toward their mother and sister, the territorial behaviors they exhibited in defending their realm, and the sophisticated magical abilities they continued to demonstrate all pointed toward the persistence of some form of identity and purpose that transcended their monstrous appearances. The Covenant of Artorias, that connected both the Forest Hunter and Chaos Servant experiences, represented the possibility that even the most catastrophic failures and devastating tragedies could serve constructive purposes if their lessons were properly understood and integrated into future attempts at moral action. Artorius's corruption by the abyss and the witch's transformation through chaotic fire were not simply cautionary tales about the dangers of overreach, but rather complex narratives that illustrated both the inevitability of failure when confronting forces beyond mortal comprehension and the potential for meaningful resistance, even in circumstances where ultimate victory was impossible. The ring that bore Artorius's name and carried his spiritual legacy served as a bridge between these different forms of tragedy and heroism, offering protection against the very forces that had destroyed its creator, while simultaneously requiring its bearer to venture into the same dangerous territories that had claimed so many previous heroes. The covenant it represented was not a promise of safety or guaranteed success, but rather an acknowledgement that some battles were worth fighting regardless of their likely outcome, some principles worth defending, even when defending them required accepting enormous personal risk. The relationship between the forest hunters and the chaos servants reflected broader themes about the proper relationship between conscious beings and the natural forces that shaped their environment. Both covenants required their members to accept responsibility for protecting something precious and vulnerable, whether ancient wisdom preserved in sacred groves or a suffering soul sustained by others' sacrifice. Both demanded that their followers make peace with the necessity of conflict and violence in service of preservation and care. Yet, the specific nature of what each covenant sought to protect created very different philosophical and practical challenges for their respective memberships. The forest hunters defended something that was inherently stable and self-sustaining, requiring intervention only when outside forces threatened to disrupt natural cycles and sacred balances. The Chaos Servants served something that was inherently unstable and consuming, requiring constant input of energy and attention simply to prevent further deterioration and collapse. This fundamental difference in the nature of their responsibilities created different types of spiritual discipline and moral development among the two groups' members. Forest hunters learned patience, vigilance, and the subtle art of intervention that preserved existing harmonies without creating new disturbances. Chaos servants developed compassion, sacrifice, and the difficult skill of caring for something that could never be truly healed or restored to its original condition. The ultimate legacy of both covenants lay not in their immediate practical effects, but in their demonstration that conscious beings retained the capacity for meaningful moral choice, even in circumstances where all available options carried significant moral costs and uncertain outcomes. The forest hunters' defense of ancient wisdom required them to commit acts of violence against souls who might not fully understand the significance of what they were threatening. The Chaos Servants' care for the Fair Lady required them to gather humanity through methods that inevitably caused suffering to other conscious beings. Neither covenant could claim moral purity or perfect alignment with abstract ethical principles, yet both offered their members opportunities to transcend purely selfish concerns and dedicate their existence to something larger and more enduring than their individual survival or comfort. The choices faced by their members, whether to defend sacred sites through force, whether to sacrifice other souls' welfare for the benefit of someone they loved, were the kinds of impossible moral dilemmas that revealed character and shaped spiritual development in ways that easier decisions never could. In the end, both the ancient wisdom preserved in Darkroot Garden and the tragic love embodied by the Chaos Servants served as reminders that meaning and purpose could be found even in the most difficult circumstances, that connection and commitment could transcend individual mortality, and that the choices made by conscious beings in response to overwhelming challenges ultimately mattered more than the specific outcomes of their actions. Whether through the patient guardianship of irreplaceable knowledge or the compassionate service to irredeemable suffering. Both covenants offered proof that hope and dignity could persist even when victory was impossible and tragedy seemed inevitable. In the deepest foundations of Lordran's moral architecture, where the very concepts of light and darkness, truth and deception, salvation and damnation intertwined like serpents locked in eternal combat, there existed two covenants that embodied humanity's most fundamental philosophical divisions about the nature of existence itself and the proper response to cosmic injustice. The Dark Wraith Covenant and the Path of the Dragon represented not merely different tactical approaches to survival in a hostile world, but rather completely incompatible visions of what consciousness ought to strive toward when faced with the ultimate revelation that reality itself might be built upon foundations of deliberate deception and systematic oppression. The Dark Wraith Covenant emerged from the teachings and revelations of Darkstalker Carthy, that ancient primordial serpent whose very existence challenged every comfortable assumption that the inhabitants of Lordran had been taught to accept about the nature of good and evil, the legitimacy of divine authority, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. Where King Seeker Frampt had presented himself as a loyal servant of the established order who sought to guide chosen undead toward fulfilling their predetermined role in maintaining the Age of Fire, Carthy offered an entirely different interpretation of history and destiny that cast the gods themselves as usurpers and oppressors who had stolen power that rightfully belonged to humanity. The Serpent's alternative narrative of the world's origins was not merely revisionist history or political propaganda designed to justify rebellion against legitimate authority, but rather a fundamental reinterpretation of cosmic justice that challenged every assumption upon which Lordran's social and spiritual order had been constructed. According to Cathy's teachings, the Age of Fire that had brought light and warmth to a world previously dominated by eternal twilight and the stone-scaled tyranny of the everlasting dragons had not been humanity's salvation, but rather the beginning of their enslavement to powers that feared and despised their true potential. The dark soul that had been humanity's portion when the first flame was divided among the great lords was not, in Cathy's understanding, a lesser prize or consolation reward compared to the mighty souls claimed by Gwyn and his allies. Instead, it represented the most precious and powerful of all the cosmic forces unleashed when the age of grey stone and eternal stagnation finally came to an end. The dark soul contained within its essence not merely the capacity for growth and change that characterized human nature, but also the potential for transcendence and transformation that made humanity the true inheritors of whatever age would follow. When the artificial construct of the Age of Fire finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, the gods' fear of this potential, Cathy argued, had led them to construct an entire civilization based upon the systematic suppression of humanity's true nature and the maintenance of artificial barriers, designed to prevent mortal souls from discovering their actual capabilities and rightful place in the cosmic order. The linking of the first flame, presented to chosen undead as the ultimate heroic sacrifice that would preserve light and warmth for all creation, was in reality nothing more than a mechanism for perpetuating divine tyranny and ensuring that humanity would never fulfill its destined role as the dominant force in whatever age was meant to follow the twilight of the gods. The Dark Wraith Covenant that formed around these revolutionary teachings attracted souls who had grown weary not merely of individual suffering or personal failure, but of the entire moral and political framework within which such suffering was expected to be endured with patience and gratitude. These were not simply rebels seeking to overturn authority for its own sake, but rather philosophers and visionaries who had come to understand that the very categories of heroism and villainy, salvation and damnation, Light and darkness had been deliberately constructed to serve the interests of those who held power, rather than to reflect any objective moral truth. The red-eye orbs that served as the Covenant's primary tool for intervention in other souls' worlds were not merely weapons or instruments of invasion, but rather symbols of a completely different understanding of individual agency and collective responsibility. Where other covenants required their members to wait for invitations or respond to calls for assistance, the Darkwraiths claimed the right to enter any world where they detected the presence of humanity that could be claimed in service of their greater cause. This aggressive approach to interaction with other undead souls reflected the Covenant's fundamental belief that the current political and spiritual order was so thoroughly corrupted that working within its established rules and procedures would never produce meaningful change. The Darkwraiths saw themselves not as criminals or invaders, but rather as liberators whose actions, however violent or disruptive they might appear to those still trapped within conventional moral frameworks, were actually serving the highest possible good by hastening the collapse of systems that prevented souls from achieving their true potential. The humanity that Darkwraiths sought to gather from their victims was not understood as a resource to be hoarded for selfish purposes, but rather as a form of spiritual currency that could be accumulated and eventually offered to the primordial serpent who would use it to accelerate the coming of the Age of Dark. Each successful invasion, each extraction of precious essence from another soul, represented both an individual victory against the forces of oppression and a contribution to the collective effort required to overthrow the entire cosmic order that kept humanity in bondage. Yet the moral complexity of the Darkwraith philosophy became apparent when one considered the actual experience of those from whom humanity was taken by force. The Covenant's grand theoretical framework about cosmic justice and humanity's destiny provided little comfort to individual souls who found themselves losing the very essence that made meaningful choice and spiritual growth possible. The Red Phantoms, who materialized in their worlds, brought not liberation, but rather a form of spiritual predation that left its victims diminished and hollow, regardless of whatever greater good their sacrifice might theoretically serve. This tension between abstract principles and concrete consequences created deep philosophical divisions even within the Darkwraith Covenant itself. Some members embraced what they saw as the necessary ruthlessness required to overthrow an unjust system, arguing that individual suffering in the present was a small price to pay for the ultimate liberation of all humanity from divine oppression. Others struggled with the moral implications of their actions, seeking to minimize unnecessary cruelty while still fulfilling their obligations to the greater cause that Cather had revealed to them. The Covenant's connection to New Londo ruins added another layer of tragic complexity to their spiritual and political mission. This once great city had been deliberately flooded by its own rulers in a desperate attempt to prevent the spread of the very darkness that the Darkwraiths now sought to accelerate and embrace. The destruction of New Londo represented one of history's most dramatic examples of the lengths to which established authority would go to maintain power, even when such maintenance required the sacrifice of entire populations who had committed no crime other than living in proximity to forces that threatened the existing order. The ghosts that haunted the flooded ruins were not merely the restless spirits of the dead, but rather the victims of political decision-making that prioritized abstract concepts of cosmic balance over the lives and welfare of actual conscious beings. Their eternal imprisonment in the submerged city served as a constant reminder of the price that ordinary souls paid when their rulers chose to preserve their own vision of proper order rather than accept the changes that natural evolution of consciousness and society would inevitably bring. The four kings of New Londo, whose corruption by the abyss had precipitated the city's destruction, represented both the ultimate failure of conventional leadership and the terrible consequences that could result when those in positions of authority attempted to manipulate forces beyond their understanding or control. Their transformation from wise rulers into agents of primordial darkness illustrated the way that power itself could become a corrupting influence, regardless of the initial intentions or moral character of those who wielded it. The abyss that had claimed the four kings was not simply another enemy to be fought and defeated, but rather a fundamental aspect of reality that existed beyond the comfortable categories of good and evil that characterized moral thinking during the Age of Fire. This primordial force represented the original state from which all conscious beings had emerged and to which they would eventually return, regardless of whatever artificial structures and institutions they might create to delay or deny this inevitable reunion with their deepest nature. The Covenant's relationship with this cosmic force was complex and ambiguous, reflecting the fundamental tension between humanity's desire for individual agency and meaning, and the Abyss's complete indifference to such concerns. While Cather taught that embracing the darkness would lead to humanity's ultimate liberation and fulfillment, the actual experience of contact with abyssal forces suggested that such liberation might come at the cost of everything that made individual consciousness valuable or meaningful in the first place. Ingward and the other sealers who maintained the magical barriers that kept New Londo's floodwaters contained represented a different response to the same cosmic forces that the Dark Wraiths sought to embrace and accelerate. These dedicated souls had chosen to spend their existence maintaining a holding action against forces they knew they could never permanently defeat, accepting the burden of eternal vigilance in exchange for the preservation of whatever time and space could be created for other souls to find their own paths toward transcendence or destruction. The Sealer's philosophy reflected a kind of tragic realism that acknowledged both the inevitability of cosmic change and the value of individual choice and experience that such change might ultimately render meaningless. Their magic was not powerful enough to reverse the fundamental processes that were drawing the Age of Fire toward its inevitable conclusion, but it was sufficient to slow those processes enough to allow for the possibility that conscious beings might discover ways of navigating the transition that preserved something of value from the current order while embracing whatever genuine improvements the coming darkness might bring. Standing in stark philosophical contrast to the Dark Wraith's revolutionary activism was the path of the Dragon, a covenant that offered not political transformation but rather personal transcendence, through the ultimate rejection of all the limitations and vulnerabilities that characterized mortal existence. This ancient discipline traced its origins back to the time before the Age of Fire, when the everlasting dragons had ruled over a world of grey stone and eternal stagnation, their immortal forms representing a kind of existence that was beyond change, beyond growth, beyond all the forms of suffering and joy that defined the experience of conscious beings caught in the flow of time. The dragons that had dominated the age before fire were not merely large and powerful creatures, but rather embodiments of a completely different relationship with existence itself. Their stone scales represented not simply natural armor, but rather a fundamental barrier between their essential nature and all the forces of change and decay that affected lesser beings. Their eternal lives were not extended versions of mortal existence, but rather participation in a form of being that existed outside the cycles of birth and death, growth and decline that defined the experience of all other forms of consciousness. The path of the Dragon Covenant offered its followers the possibility of achieving this same transcendent state through gradual transformation of both body and spirit, replacing vulnerable flesh with enduring stone and mutable consciousness with eternal, unchanging awareness. This was not merely a form of magical enhancement or protective spell, but rather a complete reconstruction of identity and purpose that required the practitioner to abandon everything that had previously defined their existence as an individual personality with specific desires, fears, and relationships. The Dragonstones that served as the Covenant's primary tools for transformation were not simple magical items, but rather crystallized fragments of the eternal dragon's essential nature, physical manifestations of the unchanging principles that had governed existence before the introduction of fire brought instability and evolution to the world. Each use of these precious artifacts brought the practitioner closer to the dragon state, gradually replacing their human characteristics with the stone-scaled immortality that represented complete freedom from all forms of vulnerability and limitation. Yet this freedom came at a cost that few souls were prepared to fully understand or accept. The dragon state that represented the Covenant's ultimate goal was not an enhanced version of human consciousness, but rather something qualitatively different that shared little with the personality and emotional capacity that had motivated the original decision to pursue transformation. The ancient dragons had been beings of perfect stability and eternal endurance, but they had also been incapable of growth, creativity, or any of the forms of change and development that gave meaning to conscious existence. The stone dragon that dwelt in the depths of Ash Lake, that primordial realm where the great arch trees supported the very foundations of the world, served as both teacher and exemplar for those who sought to follow the path of draconic transcendence. This ancient being, one of the few surviving true dragons from the age before fire, had witnessed the rise and fall of entire cosmic orders, while remaining essentially unchanged by any of the transformations that had reshaped reality around it. The dragon's willingness to share the secrets of transformation with mortal souls reflected not altruism or concern for their welfare, but rather the complete indifference to individual fate that characterized its eternal perspective. From the viewpoint of consciousness that had existed since before the concepts of life and death had any meaning, the struggles and aspirations of temporary beings were neither important enough to help nor significant enough to hinder. The dragon offered its knowledge to any who sought it with the same neutral dispassion it might show toward changes in weather or the movement of geological formations. The Covenant members who undertook the gradual transformation toward dragon form found themselves facing not merely physical changes, but rather a complete reconstruction of their relationship with time, identity, and purpose. The early stages of the process brought enhanced durability and resistance to various forms of damage, but they also began to erode the emotional connections and personal investments that had previously provided motivation and meaning for their actions. As the transformation progressed, practitioners discovered that the memories and relationships that had once seemed crucially important began to fade into irrelevance, not through forgetfulness, but through a growing awareness that such concerns belonged to a form of existence that they were gradually leaving behind. The loves and hatreds, ambitions and fears that had once driven their choices became as distant and abstract as the concerns of insects or the movements of clouds. The ultimate goal of complete dragon transformation represented both the greatest possible achievement and the most profound loss that any conscious being could experience. Those who succeeded in fully embracing the stone-scaled immortality of the ancient dragons gained freedom from all forms of suffering, limitation, and vulnerability, but they also lost everything that had made their individual existence unique and meaningful. They became eternal and indestructible, but at the cost of becoming essentially indistinguishable from stone formations or other features of the unchanging natural landscape. The philosophical implications of this transformation challenged fundamental assumptions about the value and purpose of conscious existence itself. If the highest possible achievement was the transcendence of all individual characteristics and personal investments, then what meaning could be found in the struggles and aspirations that defined mortal experience? If immortality and invulnerability could only be purchased through the surrender of everything that made consciousness valuable, then was such transcendence truly desirable, or merely another form of elaborate suicide? The relationship between the Dark Wraith and Path of the Dragon covenants reflected broader tensions within Lordran's spiritual landscape, between different approaches to the fundamental problem of existence in a world where all available options seem to involve some form of loss or compromise. The Dark Wraiths offered political revolution and cosmic transformation at the cost of individual moral clarity and personal relationships. The Dragon Path provided personal transcendence and eternal security at the price of individual identity and emotional capacity. Both covenants attracted souls who had grown weary of the limitations and vulnerabilities that characterized ordinary undead existence, but they offered radically different solutions to the same underlying dissatisfaction with the human condition. The Dark Wraiths sought to change the world in ways that would make individual flourishing possible, while the Dragon Followers sought to change themselves in ways that would make the world's problems irrelevant to their experience. The practical interactions between members of these two covenants often reflected their philosophical differences in ways that illuminated the deeper implications of their respective commitments. Dark Wraiths, who encountered Dragon Covenant members, found themselves facing opponents who could not be motivated by the usual concerns about loss of humanity or individual survival, making their standard tactics of psychological warfare and spiritual intimidation largely ineffective. Conversely, Dragon Path practitioners who encountered Dark Wraith invasions often discovered that their growing emotional detachment made it difficult to generate the passionate commitment to victory that characterized effective combat performance. As they moved closer to the dragon state of perfect equanimity, they found themselves increasingly indifferent to outcomes that had once seemed crucially important, including their own survival or defeat in battle. The ultimate irony of both covenants was that their pursuit of transcendence and transformation led them away from the very qualities that had made their original dissatisfaction with ordinary existence meaningful and motivating. The Dark Wraith's revolutionary fervor gradually transformed them into instruments of the same kind of oppression they had originally sought to overthrow, while the Dragon Path practitioners' quest for perfect invulnerability led them toward a state that resembled death more than any meaningful form of life. Yet perhaps this apparent futility was itself a form of spiritual teaching, a demonstration that the search for ultimate solutions to the fundamental problems of conscious existence was doomed to create new problems that were merely different versions of the original difficulties. The Dark Wraiths discovered that cosmic revolution was impossible without individual corruption, while the Dragon Followers learned that personal transcendence was meaningless without individual identity. The Covenant of Artorias that connected both paths to the legendary knight's sacrifice and example offered a different model for navigating these impossible choices. Rather than seeking ultimate solutions or perfect transcendence, Artorias had chosen to accept the limitations and vulnerabilities of mortal existence while using them as the foundation for heroic action that served purposes larger than his individual survival or satisfaction. The knight's ultimate corruption and defeat demonstrated that even this approach could not guarantee success or prevent tragedy, but his example suggested that meaning and value could be found in the struggle itself, rather than in any particular outcome or achievement. The covenant that bore his name offered protection against the very forces that had destroyed him, but it also required its bearers to venture into the same dangerous territories and face the same impossible choices that had tested every hero who had come before. In the end, both the revolutionary darkness of the Dark Wraith Covenant and the transcendent stone of the Dragon Path served as reminders that conscious beings remained capable of imagining and pursuing alternatives to whatever circumstances they found, unsatisfactory, even when such alternatives carried costs that might ultimately prove greater than the original problems they sought to solve. The courage to seek transformation whether personal or political, represented one of the highest expressions of consciousness itself, regardless of whether particular attempts at change succeeded or failed. The eternal conflict between the desire for individual agency and the longing for perfect security, between the need for meaningful choice and the wish for transcendent certainty, would continue to shape the destinies of all who bore the curse of consciousness, in a world where every possible path led through forms of loss and limitation that could never be completely overcome or permanently avoided. Yet the very existence of such alternatives, however flawed or costly, offered proof that hope and dignity could persist even in circumstances where victory was impossible, and wisdom suggested that all struggle was ultimately futile. In the deepest chambers beneath Lordran's foundations, where the very concepts of life and death became meaningless distinctions in the face of forces that predated both states of being, there existed covenants born from humanity's most ancient fears and most desperate attempts to impose order upon the fundamental chaos that governed existence at its most elemental level. The Gravelord Servant Covenant and the mysterious Book of the Guilty represented two faces of the same terrible truth, that death was not an ending, but merely another form of beginning, and that the moral categories by which conscious beings attempted to navigate their existence were themselves subject to judgment by powers that operated according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. The Gravelord Covenant emerged from the domain of Gravelord Nito, that ancient lord of death, whose authority over the termination of existence had been established not through conquest or political maneuvering, but through the simple recognition that he embodied forces that had been operating since before. Consciousness itself had emerged to question or resist them. Nito was not merely a powerful undead being who had achieved dominion over lesser creatures through superior strength or cunning, but rather the physical manifestation of death itself as a cosmic principle, the living embodiment of the inevitable conclusion toward which all forms of existence moved regardless of their individual desires or collective efforts to postpone or avoid that final destination. The Lord of Death's domain in the depths of the catacombs was not simply an underground realm where the deceased were buried and forgotten, but rather a vast necropolis that served as the intersection between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond the threshold of mortal existence. Here, in chambers carved from living rock and decorated with the accumulated bones of countless generations, death revealed itself not as the absence of life, but as another form of being that operated according to its own complex rules and mysterious purposes. The skeletons that wandered endlessly through these subterranean passages were not merely animated corpses driven by residual magical energy, but rather expressions of death's refusal to accept the artificial boundaries that living beings attempted to impose upon the natural cycles of existence. Their ceaseless resurrection and eternal wandering demonstrated that the distinction between life and death was far more fluid and ambiguous than most conscious beings preferred to acknowledge, a recognition that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity, continuity, and the meaning of individual existence. The Gravelord Servant Covenant that formed around Nito's authority attracted souls who had come to understand that their ongoing existence as undead beings had already placed them beyond the normal categories of life and death, making them uniquely qualified to serve as intermediaries between these supposedly distinct states of being. These were not individuals who had simply grown comfortable with mortality or accepted the inevitability of their own eventual destruction, but rather beings who had recognized that their undead condition offered opportunities for understanding and influencing forces that remained hidden from those who still clung to conventional distinctions between the living and the prosents. Dead, the great scythe that served as the Covenant's signature weapon, was not merely an oversized farming implement adapted for combat purposes, but rather a tool specifically designed for harvesting souls in the same way that ordinary scythes gathered grain or grass. Its curved blade could cut through the spiritual bonds that connected consciousness to physical form, separating essence from vessel in ways that allowed for the kind of precise manipulation of death and resurrection that characterized the most advanced necromantic practices. Yet the Covenant's true power lay not in individual weapons or combat techniques, but in the Gravelord's sword dance, a ritual that allowed sufficiently advanced practitioners to influence the very fabric of reality across multiple worlds simultaneously. This miraculous ability represented more than simply an extension of normal magical practice into new territories, but rather a fundamental manipulation of the cosmic forces that governed the relationship between different planes of existence and the souls that moved between them. When a Gravelord's servant performed the sword dance, they were not merely casting a spell or activating a magical item, but rather participating in an ancient ritual that had been designed by Nito himself to demonstrate the ultimate futility of all attempts to create permanent boundaries between different states of being. The phantoms that appeared in other worlds as a result of this dance were not random manifestations of magical energy, but rather carefully selected representations of the kind of enhanced mortality that awaited all conscious beings who refused to acknowledge death's ultimate authority over their existence. These black phantoms carried within their dark essence all the accumulated wisdom and power that came from accepting rather than resisting the natural cycles of death and rebirth that governed all existence. They were not simply more dangerous versions of ordinary enemies, but rather teachers whose lessons could only be learned through direct confrontation with the enhanced mortality they represented. Their appearance in worlds where souls had grown too comfortable with their temporary victories over death served as reminders that no achievement, however significant, could permanently exempt anyone from the cosmic forces that Nito embodied. The Covenant's philosophy extended beyond mere acceptance of death as an inevitable conclusion to embrace death as an active principle that could be channeled and directed in service of purposes that transcended individual survival or personal achievement. Gravelord servants learned to see themselves not as beings struggling against mortality, but rather as conscious agents of the very forces that would eventually claim all existence, finding in this apparent surrender a form of power and purpose that was unavailable to those who continued to resist the natural order. Yet this embrace of death's authority was not a simple matter of fatalistic resignation or morbid obsession with destruction and decay. The Covenant's deepest teachings suggested that death, properly understood, was not the opposite of life, but rather its necessary complement, the force that gave meaning and urgency to all forms of creative activity and conscious choice. Without the reality of endings, beginnings would have no significance. Without the possibility of loss, achievement would carry no weight. Without the prospect of separation, connection would inspire no cherishing. The tragic figure of Paladin Leroy illustrated both the potential nobility and the inevitable corruption that characterized all attempts to serve death's purposes while maintaining individual moral identity and personal relationships. This legendary knight had once been among the most devoted servants of the gods, his faith in divine justice and commitment to protecting the innocent, making him a paragon of everything that the Age of Fire claimed to represent in terms of moral order and spiritual purpose. Yet Leroy's ultimate embrace of the Gravelord Covenant represented not a betrayal of his original principles, but rather their logical conclusion in a world where the gods themselves had proven fallible and the institutions they had established had become sources of oppression rather than liberation. His transformation from paladin to servant of death reflected the recognition that true justice might require the destruction of existing systems that claim to serve good while actually perpetuating suffering and inequality. The grant that served as Leroy's signature weapon embodied this transformation from protective to destructive purpose, its massive weight and crushing power, representing the kind of overwhelming force that was sometimes necessary to break through the defensive barriers that protected unjust systems from the consequences of their own corruption. Yet even in his service to death, Leroy retained something of his original nobility, his attacks carrying not the random cruelty of mindless destruction, but rather the focused intention of someone seeking to clear away obstacles to genuine justice. The catacombs themselves served as a vast laboratory where the principles of death and resurrection were studied and refined through centuries of practical experimentation. The necromancers who worked in these depths had discovered methods for manipulating the boundary between life and death that went far beyond simple reanimation of corpses or communication with departed spirits. Their techniques allowed for the precise control of various forms of undead existence, creating servants whose capabilities could be tailored to specific purposes and whose loyalty was guaranteed by their complete dependence upon their creator's continued magical support. Vamos, the skeleton blacksmith, represented one of the most sophisticated applications of these necromantic principles, a being whose consciousness and skills had been preserved and enhanced through careful magical intervention, while his physical form had been reduced to the essential minimum necessary for his continued function. His ability to work with divine and occult materials reflected not merely technical expertise, but rather an understanding of the fundamental forces that governed the relationship between spiritual essence and physical manifestation. The divine ember that Vamos could use to enhance weapons with holy power represented one of the most profound ironies in all of Lordran's spiritual landscape, that the power to create instruments capable of permanently destroying undead beings was maintained and dispensed by an undead craftsman whose own existence depended upon the same necromantic principles that divine weapons were designed to counter. This apparent contradiction reflected deeper truths about the interconnectedness of all cosmic forces and the impossibility of creating pure categories that could completely separate opposing principles from one another. The occult ember that served as counterpart to the divine enhancement offered weapons the ability to inflict particularly devastating damage upon the gods themselves, revealing that the same necromantic knowledge that could create tools for preserving divine authority could also produce instruments for overthrowing that authority when circumstances required such drastic action. Vamos's willingness to provide both types of enhancement to any customer who brought the appropriate materials suggested that the true masters of death's mysteries operated beyond conventional moral categories, offering their services according to principles that transcended simple distinctions between good and evil. The Book of the Guilty, maintained by Oswald of Kerim, in his capacity as both pardoner and intelligence gatherer, for forces whose ultimate allegiances remained deliberately obscured, represented a different approach to the fundamental questions of justice and moral accountability that characterized existence in a world where traditional institutions had failed to provide adequate guidance or protection. This mysterious tome served not merely as a record of individual transgressions, but rather as a comprehensive catalogue of the ways in which conscious beings violated the trust and cooperation that made civilized existence possible. Oswald himself embodied the complex relationship between mercy and judgment that characterized all serious attempts to address moral failure and social breakdown. His role as pardoner required him to offer forgiveness and absolution to souls who sought to escape the consequences of their past actions. Yet his compilation of the Book of the Guilty demonstrated his recognition that some forms of wrongdoing could not be simply forgiven and forgotten without creating even greater injustices for their victims. The Velka connection that scholars detected in both Oswald's methods and the book's underlying philosophy suggested that these systems of moral accounting were connected to older and more fundamental principles of cosmic justice that predated the establishment of the current divine order. The goddess of sin, whose worship had been driven underground but never completely eliminated, represented an understanding of moral law that was based not on the arbitrary commands of those in power, but rather on the inherent structure of reality itself and the natural consequences that flowed from different types of action and intention. The concept of sin itself, as understood within this framework, was not primarily about disobedience to divine commands or violation of religious taboos, but rather about the disruption of the delicate relationships and mutual dependencies that allowed conscious beings to coexist in relative peace and prosperity. The sins recorded in Oswald's book were those that attacked the very foundations of trust and cooperation upon which all civilized existence depended, making their perpetrators threats not merely to specific individuals, but to the possibility of community itself. The indictments that appeared in the book ranged from relatively straightforward cases of murder and theft to more subtle forms of betrayal and deception that were harder to define, but equally destructive in their long-term effects upon social cohesion and individual willingness to risk vulnerability for the sake of connection with others. The invasion of worlds, where souls had sought sanctuary, the breaking of oaths and agreements that had been freely entered, the exploitation of trust for personal advantage. All of these represented different forms of the same fundamental assault upon the bonds that held civilization together. The process by which souls were added to the book remained deliberately mysterious, reflecting both the practical difficulties of gathering accurate information about events that often occurred in isolated locations with few witnesses, and the deeper philosophical challenge of determining which actions truly deserved supernatural intervention and which could be adequately addressed through ordinary human responses. The criteria for inclusion seemed to involve not merely the objective harm caused by particular actions, but also the intentions and circumstances that had motivated them, creating a system of moral evaluation that was far more sophisticated than simple rule-based approaches to ethical judgment. The relationship between the Book of the Guilty and the various covenant systems that enabled souls to hunt and punish those whose names appeared within its pages created a complex web of accountability and retribution that operated according to principles that were both more flexible and more comprehensive than any formal legal system. The blue-eye orbs that allowed dark moon blades to track and confront sinners were not random instruments of vigilante justice, but rather carefully targeted interventions designed to address specific forms of moral failure through direct confrontation with the consequences of one's choices. Yet the system's reliance upon voluntary participation by souls who chose to serve as agents of divine justice created opportunities for both abuse and neglect that complicated any simple assessment of its effectiveness or moral legitimacy. The Dark Moon Blades, who answered the call to punish sinners, were themselves fallible beings whose motivations might include personal desires for violence or domination, alongside genuine commitment to justice and moral order. Their interventions, however well-intentioned, carried the risk of escalating conflicts and creating new cycles of revenge that could ultimately cause more harm than the original sins they sought to address. The absolution services that Oswald provided offered a counterbalance to this system of supernatural punishment, creating opportunities for souls to escape the consequences of their past actions through combinations of genuine repentance, practical restitution, and payment of fees that demonstrated their commitment to avoiding similar transgressions in the future. This mechanism for removing names from the Book of the Guilty reflected the recognition that moral failure was not necessarily permanent, and that conscious beings retained the capacity for growth and change even after committing serious violations of trust and community standards. The cost of such absolution, both in terms of souls surrendered and lifestyle changes required, was deliberately substantial enough to ensure that the process represented genuine transformation rather than mere expedient escape from unpleasant consequences. Those who sought Oswald's services were required to demonstrate their commitment to reform through actions that carried real sacrifice and ongoing accountability, creating a form of rehabilitation that addressed both the practical harm caused by their transgressions and the underlying attitudes and choices that had made such harm possible. The ultimate effectiveness of both the punishment and absolution systems depended not merely on their mechanical operation, but on their contribution to the broader cultural understanding of moral responsibility and social obligation that characterized Lordran's spiritual landscape. The existence of supernatural consequences for serious moral failures served to reinforce the message that individual choices mattered not only for their immediate practical effects, but also for their contribution to the larger patterns of trust and cooperation that made civilized existence possible. Yet the availability of genuine opportunities for redemption and rehabilitation prevented this system from becoming purely punitive or fatalistic, maintaining space for hope and growth that encouraged souls to continue striving for moral improvement even after experiencing serious failures. The balance between accountability and mercy that characterized the Covenant's overall approach reflected deep wisdom about the complexity of moral development and the need for systems that could respond appropriately to the full range of human motivations and capabilities. The tragic irony that pervaded both the Gravelord and Book of the Guilty systems was their dependence upon the same forms of violence and coercion that they sought to regulate and control. The Gravelord's servants, who spread enhanced mortality throughout multiple worlds, were themselves engaging in forms of invasion and disruption that differed from ordinary sins primarily in their cosmic scope and supernatural authorization. The Darkmoon Blades, who hunted sinners, were committing acts of violence that would themselves merit punishment if performed without divine sanction and cosmic justification. This fundamental contradiction reflected deeper truths about the impossibility of creating perfectly just systems within a world that was itself built upon foundations of violence and oppression. The covenants that sought to impose moral order inevitably found themselves employing methods that violated the very principles they claimed to serve, creating moral compromises that challenged simple distinctions between heroic justice and criminal wrongdoing. Yet perhaps this apparent futility was itself a form of wisdom, a recognition that the struggle for justice and moral order was an ongoing process rather than a problem that could be solved through the application of sufficient force or clever institutional design. The Gravelord's servants and the agents of divine punishment served not as final arbiters of cosmic justice, but rather as reminders that actions had consequences, that moral choices mattered, and that the communities and relationships that gave meaning to individual existence required constant vigilance and active protection from those who would exploit or destroy them. In the end, both death's embrace and divine judgment served as expressions of the fundamental human need to believe that existence possessed some form of inherent meaning and moral structure, even when direct experience suggested that conscious beings were ultimately alone in an indifferent universe. The covenants that offered service to these cosmic principles provided their members with ways of participating in something larger than their individual survival or personal satisfaction, creating opportunities for transcendence that remained available even when traditional sources of meaning and purpose had been corrupted or destroyed. In the forgotten corners of Lordran's vast spiritual landscape, where the very concepts of covenant and allegiance dissolved into mysteries that predated the establishment of formal religious institutions or organized attempts to categorize the relationships between conscious beings and the cosmic forces that shape their existence, there existed bonds and obligations that operated according to principles so ancient and fundamental that they challenged every assumption about the nature of choice, destiny, and individual agency that characterized more conventional approaches to spiritual development and moral commitment. The Northern Undead Asylum, that grim fortress perched on the edge of the known world like a monument to humanity's capacity for both hope and despair, represented more than merely a repository for those who had been afflicted by the curse of undeath. This massive complex of stone walls and iron bars had been constructed not as a prison in any conventional sense, but rather as a kind of spiritual laboratory where the fundamental questions about the nature of the undead condition could be explored through direct observation and careful experimentation with souls whose normal social connections and worldly obligations had been severed by their transformation into beings that existed between life and death. The asylum's true purpose, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic justification and humanitarian rhetoric, was to serve as a selection mechanism for identifying those rare individuals whose response to the undead curse demonstrated the kind of spiritual resilience and moral clarity that might qualify them for roles in cosmic events whose scope and significance dwarfed ordinary human concerns about justice, mercy, or individual welfare. The hundreds of hollow beings who wandered through its corridors and cells were not simply victims of an arbitrary disease, but rather participants in a vast sorting process that would eventually separate those who retained the capacity for meaningful choice from those who had surrendered to the spiritual entropy that represented the curse's ultimate victory over conscious will. Oscar of Astora, the knight whose fate had become so inextricably intertwined with the destiny of every soul who would eventually be recognized as a chosen undead, embodied the tragic complexity that characterized all attempts to serve purposes larger than individual survival or personal happiness. His presence in the asylum was not accidental or coincidental, but rather the culmination of a lifetime spent preparing for a role that required him to sacrifice his own opportunities for heroic achievement in order to ensure that someone else might have the chance to accomplish what he himself could bearings never complete. The knight's understanding of his mission reflected a sophisticated grasp of cosmic mechanics that went far beyond simple prophecy or divine command. Oscar had recognized that the selection of chosen undead could not be left to chance or arbitrary divine intervention, but required careful preparation and deliberate action by someone who possessed both the knowledge necessary to identify potential heroes and the spiritual strength required to accept that his own role would be limited to enabling others' achievements rather than pursuing glory for himself. His placement of the peculiar doll that would allow chosen undead to gain entry to Anor Londo represented one of the most subtle and far-reaching interventions in the cosmic order that any individual soul had ever attempted. This simple act of preparation, performed in anticipation of events that might not occur for years or decades, demonstrated a level of faith and commitment that transcended ordinary understanding of cause and effect, individual agency, and collective destiny. The doll itself was not merely a magical key or token of permission, but rather a physical manifestation of the complex relationships between different planes of existence and the souls who moved between them. Its creation had required not only technical knowledge of interdimensional travel and divine politics, but also the kind of spiritual authority that could only be earned through years of service and sacrifice in pursuit of purposes that offered no guarantee of personal reward or recognition. Oscar's relationship with the asylum's other inhabitants reflected the fundamental loneliness that characterized all attempts to serve cosmic purposes while maintaining individual consciousness and moral identity. The hollow beings who surrounded him were not companions or allies, but rather cautionary examples of what awaited all undead souls who lacked the spiritual resources necessary to resist the curse's gradual erosion of will and Bonked purpose. Yet his commitment to his mission prevented him from allowing their tragic condition to deter him from the preparations that might enable someone else to avoid their fate. The knight's eventual hollowing, which would occur regardless of whether his mission succeeded or failed, represented the ultimate sacrifice that was required of all who chose to serve purposes larger than their own survival or happiness. His acceptance of this inevitable outcome demonstrated a form of heroism that was perhaps more profound than any achievement that could be accomplished through skill in combat or resistance to supernatural corruption, for it required the willing surrender of everything that made individual existence meaningful in exchange for the possibility that cosmic justice might eventually be served. The asylum demons that served as the facility's guardians and executioners operated according to principles that reflected the institution's deeper purpose, while obscuring its true nature from casual observation. These creatures were not simply monsters or obstacles placed randomly throughout the complex, but rather sophisticated testing mechanisms designed to evaluate the capabilities and motivations of souls who attempted to escape their confinement and venture forth into the wider world. The asylum demon's massive size and overwhelming physical presence served to eliminate those undead whose response to challenge was limited to conventional combat techniques or straightforward applications of individual strength and skill. Only those who possessed the creativity and adaptability necessary to discover alternative approaches to seemingly impossible obstacles would survive this initial test and proceed to the more complex trials that awaited them beyond the asylum's walls. The stray demon that lurked in the depths beneath the main complex represented a different form of evaluation, one that tested souls' willingness to return to places and situations they had previously escaped, their capacity for growth and learning from past experiences, and their commitment to completeness rather than mere expedience in their approach to moral and spiritual challenges. The valuable rewards that could only be obtained through this voluntary return to danger demonstrated that the asylum's true lessons could only be learned by those who possessed the courage to confront their own limitations and the wisdom to recognize that apparent victory might be incomplete without deeper understanding. The relationship between the asylum and the broader network of covenants that operated throughout Lordran reflected the complex ways in which individual choices and cosmic purposes intersected to create patterns of meaning that transcended simple causation or mechanical determinism. The souls who emerged from the asylum's trials carried with them not only enhanced capabilities and valuable equipment, but also a deeper understanding of the relationship between personal agency and collective destiny that would shape their approach to every subsequent choice and commitment they encountered. This understanding manifested most clearly in their relationship with the Dragon Covenant, that ancient discipline whose origins predated the establishment of any formal religious institution or organized attempt to categorize spiritual development according to systematic principles. The path of the dragon represented not merely another option among many possible forms of magical enhancement or protective association, but rather the purest expression of consciousness, seeking to transcend all the limitations and vulnerabilities that characterized existence within the cycles of time and change that defined ordinary experience. The dragon stones that served as the Covenant's primary tools for transformation carried within their crystalline structure not only the power to alter physical form and spiritual essence, but also the accumulated wisdom of beings who had achieved the kind of perfect stability and eternal endurance that represented the ultimate goal of all conscious striving. These were not simply magical items to be collected and utilized according to immediate tactical needs, but rather sacred artifacts whose proper use required complete commitment to principles that challenged every assumption about identity, purpose, and individual agency that characterized conventional approaches to existence. The gradual transformation that resulted from sustained use of dragonstones was not merely a matter of acquiring enhanced abilities or protective characteristics, but rather a fundamental reconstruction of consciousness itself, according to principles that existed beyond the ordinary categories of growth and decay, success and failure that governed mortal experience. Each stage of this transformation required the practitioner to surrender another aspect of their individual identity and personal history, replacing the complex web of relationships and investments that had previously provided meaning and motivation with the kind of perfect equanimity that characterized beings who existed beyond the reach of loss or disappointment. The stone dragon of Ash Lake, that primordial teacher whose wisdom had been accumulated across eons of existence that predated the rise and fall of civilizations, served as both exemplar and guide for souls who sought to follow this path of ultimate transcendence. This ancient being had witnessed the transformation of the world from the age of grey, stone, and eternal dragons to the age of fire and mortal striving, and would presumably survive whatever changes might follow the current cosmic order's inevitable collapse. The dragon's willingness to share the secrets of transformation with any soul who demonstrated sufficient commitment reflected not generosity or concern for individual welfare, but rather the complete indifference to personal fate that characterized consciousness which had achieved perfect stability. From the perspective of being that had transcended all forms of attachment and investment, the struggles and aspirations of temporary beings were neither important enough to help nor significant enough to hinder. Yet this apparent indifference contained within it a form of wisdom that was perhaps more profound than any teaching that could be communicated through direct instruction or explicit guidance. The dragon's example demonstrated that it was possible to exist beyond the reach of all forms of suffering and limitation, but it also illustrated the price that must be paid for such transcendence, the surrender of everything that made individual consciousness distinctive and personally meaningful. The Covenant members who undertook the gradual transformation toward dragon form found themselves confronting not merely physical changes or enhanced capabilities, but rather fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness itself and the value of individual existence within the broader context of cosmic order. The early stages of the process brought practical benefits in terms of durability and resistance to various forms of damage, but they also began to erode the emotional connections and personal investments that had previously provided direction and purpose for their actions. As the transformation progressed, practitioners discovered that the memories and relationships that had once seemed crucially important began to fade not through forgetfulness or neglect, but through a growing awareness that such concerns belonged to a form of existence that they were gradually leaving behind. The loves and hatreds, ambitions and fears that had once driven their choices became as distant and abstract as the concerns of insects or the movements of celestial bodies. The ultimate goal of complete dragon transformation represented both the greatest possible achievement and the most profound loss that any conscious being could experience. Those who succeeded in fully embracing the stone-scaled immortality of the ancient dragons gained freedom from all forms of vulnerability and limitation, but they also lost everything that had made their individual existence unique and personally meaningful. They became eternal and indestructible, but at the cost of becoming essentially indistinguishable from natural features or geological formations. The philosophical implications of this transformation challenged fundamental assumptions about the purpose and value of conscious existence itself. If the highest possible achievement was the transcendence of all individual characteristics and personal investments, then what meaning could be found in the struggles and relationships that defined mortal experience? If immortality and invulnerability could only be purchased through the surrender of everything that made consciousness valuable, then was such transcendence truly desirable, or merely another form of elaborate suicide? The relationship between the Asylum's selection process and the Dragon Covenant's transformative discipline reflected deeper truths about the nature of spiritual development and the complex ways in which individual choices contributed to patterns of meaning that extended far beyond personal satisfaction or immediate practical benefit. The souls who emerged from the Asylum's trials possessed not only enhanced capabilities for survival and achievement, but also a heightened awareness of the relationship between personal agency and cosmic purpose that made them uniquely qualified to understand and evaluate the Dragon Path's ultimate implications. This understanding manifested in their approach to the gradual transformation process, which they undertook not as an escape from the challenges and responsibilities of conscious existence, but rather as another form of service to purposes that transcended individual welfare or personal ambition. Their willingness to surrender their humanity in pursuit of draconic transcendence represented not despair or resignation, but rather the same kind of heroic commitment to cosmic order that had motivated their original escape from the Asylum and their subsequent adventures throughout Lordran. The correlation between different Covenant philosophies and approaches to spiritual development created opportunities for souls to move between various forms of commitment and service according to their evolving understanding of cosmic purpose and individual responsibility. The Asylum's graduates were uniquely positioned to appreciate these correlations because their initial trials had taught them to see beyond immediate practical considerations to the deeper patterns of meaning that connected apparently separate institutions and disciplines. The ancient dragonstones that enabled physical transformation were not merely tools for individual enhancement, but rather fragments of a cosmic principle that had governed existence before the introduction of fire brought instability and change to the world. Their use required not only courage and commitment, but also the kind of wisdom that could only be developed through direct confrontation with the fundamental questions about consciousness and identity that characterized all serious spiritual inquiry. The network of relationships between souls who had chosen different paths of transcendence created a complex web of mutual understanding and shared purpose that operated beneath the surface of apparent conflict and competition between various covenants. The Dragon Path practitioners who encountered members of other disciplines found themselves able to communicate and cooperate in ways that transcended the specific doctrinal differences that separated their respective approaches to spiritual development. This deeper level of connection reflected the recognition that all genuine attempts at transcendence were ultimately directed toward the same fundamental goal, the achievement of existence beyond the reach of suffering and limitation that characterized ordinary consciousness trapped within cycles of time and change. The different methods and philosophies represented various approaches to this shared aspiration, rather than competing alternatives that required exclusive commitment or partisan loyalty. The ultimate legacy of both the Asylum's selection process and the Dragon Covenant's transformative discipline lay not in their immediate practical effects or specific achievements, but in their contribution to the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself and the gradual development of beings capable of serving purposes that extended beyond individual survival or personal satisfaction. The souls who underwent these trials and transformations became part of a larger pattern of meaning that would continue to unfold across cosmic timescales that dwarfed ordinary human concerns about immediate outcomes or recognizable forms of success and failure. In the end, both the hidden covenant of the Asylum's purpose and the ancient discipline of draconic transformation served as reminders that conscious beings remained capable of choosing paths that led beyond the ordinary limitations of individual existence, even when such choices required the surrender of everything that had previously defined their identity and provided meaning for their actions. The courage to seek transcendence, whether through service to cosmic selection processes or personal transformation into eternal stone, represented one of the highest expressions of consciousness itself, regardless of whether particular attempts at transcendence succeeded according to conventional measures of achievement and recognition. In the deeper mysteries of covenant membership that lay beneath the surface of ritual and ceremony, oath and allegiance, there existed a complex economy of spiritual currency and sacred exchange that transformed the very essence of what it meant to be conscious, moral, and connected to purposes larger than individual survival or personal satisfaction. The items, ranks, and rewards that characterized each covenant system of recognition and advancement were not merely material incentives or mechanical progressions through predetermined stages of development, but rather physical manifestations of profound metaphysical transformations that reshaped the fundamental relationship between individual souls and the cosmic forces that governed existence at its most elemental level. Humanity, that precious essence which served as the primary currency for most covenant transactions and spiritual exchanges, represented far more than simply another form of magical energy or tradable resource that could be accumulated through successful combat or careful exploration of dangerous territories. Each fragment of humanity carried within its dark substance the concentrated essence of what made conscious beings capable of choice, growth, and meaningful connection with other souls who shared the burden and privilege of awareness in a world that seemed largely indifferent to their struggles and aspirations. The process by which humanity was gathered, preserved, and eventually offered in service to various covenant purposes reflected deep truths about the nature of consciousness itself and the ways in which individual identity could be shared, transferred, or transformed through acts of voluntary sacrifice or involuntary extraction. When an undead soul chose to offer their accumulated humanity to the fair lady of Izalith, they were not merely providing fuel for her continued existence, but rather sharing the very essence of their capacity for hope, love, and meaningful choice with someone whose own humanity had been so thoroughly corrupted by chaos that she could no longer sustain these qualities through her own spiritual resources. Similarly, when Dark Wraith Covenant members extracted humanity from their victims through acts of invasion and spiritual predation, they were engaging in a form of vampirism that went far beyond simple theft of valuable resources to encompass the literal consumption of other beings' capacity for moral agency and emotional connection. The Red Phantoms who materialized in invaded worlds carried within their crimson essence not only enhanced combat capabilities, but also the accumulated humanity of countless previous victims. making them walking repositories of stolen consciousness and appropriated spiritual development. The Covenant rank progressions that rewarded sustained service and demonstrated commitment through increasingly valuable gifts and enhanced abilities reflected sophisticated understanding of how spiritual development actually occurred in practice rather than in theory. The early stages of membership in any covenant typically provided modest benefits that enhanced survival capabilities without fundamentally altering the practitioner's relationship with cosmic forces or their understanding of their place within the larger patterns of meaning that governed existence beyond individual concerns. As covenant members advanced through higher ranks of recognition and responsibility, the rewards they received began to include items and abilities that could not be obtained through any other means, reflecting their growing integration into spiritual economies that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those that governed ordinary material exchange. The lightning spear miracles that were granted to advanced members of the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant carried within their crackling energy not merely destructive power, but also the accumulated wisdom of countless souls who had chosen cooperation over competition, mutual aid over selfish advancement. The Dark Moon Blade enchantment that represented the highest reward for service to Gwendolyn's covenant of divine justice was not simply a weapon enhancement that increased damage output, but rather a physical manifestation of moral authority that allowed its wielder to channel the pale light of cosmic judgment directly through their chosen instrument of combat. When a Dark Moon Blade struck an enemy, while blessed with this ethereal radiance, they were not merely inflicting physical harm, but rather serving as conscious agents of forces that transcended individual will or personal desire for victory. The Great Scythe and other unique weapons that could only be obtained through advanced Covenant service represented tools that had been specifically designed for purposes that extended beyond ordinary combat or material achievement. These implements carried within their physical structure the crystallized essence of particular spiritual disciplines and philosophical approaches to the fundamental challenges of conscious existence. The Gravelord's sword, with its distinctive curved blade and necromantic properties, was not merely an effective weapon for harvesting souls, but rather a physical manifestation of death's authority over all forms of temporary existence. The Covenant-specific spells and miracles that became available to practitioners who demonstrated sufficient dedication to their chosen spiritual disciplines represented forms of knowledge that could not be learned through conventional study or acquired through simple accumulation of magical experience. These techniques required not merely intellectual understanding of their theoretical principles, but rather complete integration of the philosophical frameworks that gave them meaning and made their successful application possible. The Chaos Storm pyromancy that could be obtained through service to the Fair Lady was not simply a more powerful version of ordinary fire magic, but rather a direct channeling of the same chaotic energies that had transformed the Witch of Blasik's Fair Lady, Izalith, and her daughters into their current tragic forms. Its successful use required the practitioner to temporarily embrace the same principles of creative destruction and uncontrolled transformation that had caused one of the most catastrophic disasters in all of recorded history, making it as dangerous to its wielder as to any intended target. The Force miracle that served as one of the fundamental techniques taught by the Way of White Covenant appeared deceptively simple in its effects, creating invisible barriers of divine energy that could repel enemies or deflect incoming attacks. Yet its proper understanding required deep appreciation for the relationship between individual will and cosmic authority, personal agency, and divine mandate that characterized the most sophisticated forms of religious practice and spiritual development. The metaphysical weight of oath-breaking that accompanied abandonment of covenant membership created consequences that extended far beyond simple loss of accumulated benefits or access to exclusive rewards. When a soul chose to sever their connection with a particular covenant, they were not merely cancelling a contract or changing their organizational affiliation, but rather fundamentally altering their relationship with the cosmic forces that the covenant represented and channeled. The sin that accumulated through acts of betrayal or abandonment was not simply a matter of violating arbitrary rules or failing to fulfill bureaucratic obligations, but rather a recognition that certain forms of commitment created spiritual bonds that could not be severed without doing violence to the very fabric of meaning and trust that held conscious communities together. The souls who betrayed their covenant oaths carried within their essence a form of corruption that marked them as fundamentally unreliable participants in any future attempts at collective action or shared purpose. Oswald of Karim's Absolution Services provided a mechanism for removing the spiritual contamination that resulted from covenant betrayal, but the cost of such purification reflected the serious nature of the damage that had been done to the cosmic order through acts of deliberate faithlessness. The souls required for absolution were not simply payment for services rendered, but rather the spiritual currency necessary to repair the metaphysical wounds that had been inflicted upon the universe itself through violations of sacred trust. The Covenant of Artorias occupied a unique position within this complex economy of spiritual exchange and sacred obligation, serving not as one option among many, but rather as a meta-covenant that made participation in certain cosmic events possible, regardless of one's other affiliations or commitments. This legendary ring represented the crystallized essence of heroic sacrifice and moral commitment that transcended any particular institutional framework or doctrinal allegiance. The ring's creation had required not merely technical skill in magical craftsmanship, but rather the willing surrender of everything that had made its creator's individual existence meaningful and distinctive. Artorias had poured his very soul into the covenant that bore his name, ensuring that future heroes would possess the protection necessary to confront the same abyssal forces that had ultimately claimed his life and sanity. The ring served as both memorial to his sacrifice and practical tool for those who would continue the work he had been unable to complete. The four kings who had originally received rings of covenant from Gwyn represented an earlier attempt at creating the kind of spiritual bonds that could maintain order and cooperation across vast distances and disparate communities. Their eventual corruption by the Abyss demonstrated both the power of such covenants to shape the destiny of entire civilizations and the terrible consequences that could result when those entrusted with such authority proved unable to resist the temptations and pressures that accompanied ultimate responsibility. The Lord Vessel that served as the ultimate focus for the chosen undead's cosmic mission represented the culmination of all covenant philosophy and practice, a sacred artifact that required its bearer to transcend every form of partial commitment or limited allegiance in favor of complete dedication to purposes that encompassed the welfare of all existence. This ancient chalice was not merely a container for powerful souls, but rather a physical manifestation of the principle that individual consciousness could serve as a conduit for cosmic transformation if properly prepared and sufficiently committed to the greater good. The souls of the great lords that filled the Lord Vessel represented different aspects of the cosmic order that had governed existence during the Age of Fire, each one embodying particular principles and powers that had shaped the development of civilization and consciousness throughout the known world. Gwyn's soul carried within its radiance the accumulated authority and responsibility that came with serving as the ultimate guarantor of light and order against the forces of chaos and entropy that constantly threatened to overwhelm all conscious achievement. Nito's soul contained the wisdom and power that came from accepting death as a natural and necessary part of existence, rather than an enemy to be defeated or avoided at all costs. The Witch of Izalith's soul bore within its chaotic essence both the creative potential and destructive capability that characterized all attempts to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality according to individual will or collective need. The unique properties that these great souls possessed made them unsuitable for ordinary consumption or casual use in enhancing individual capabilities or powers. Their integration into the Lord vessel required not merely physical placement, but rather spiritual alignment between the bearer's consciousness and the cosmic principles that each soul represented. The chosen undead, who successfully gathered all the required souls, had demonstrated through their actions and choices a level of moral development and spiritual maturity that qualified them to serve as conscious agents of cosmic transformation. The covenant mechanics that governed interaction between different forms of spiritual commitment and institutional allegiance reflected deep understanding of how individual psychology and collective purpose intersected to create sustainable communities of practice and mutual support. The systems that allowed souls to maintain membership in multiple covenants simultaneously recognized that different aspects of spiritual development required different forms of guidance and community, while the penalties for abandonment or betrayal acknowledged that certain commitments were too fundamental to be treated as casual lifestyle choices. The summoning mechanics that enabled cooperative gameplay and mutual assistance between souls who shared compatible covenant affiliations represented more than merely convenient features for overcoming difficult challenges or accessing content that might otherwise remain hidden. These systems embodied philosophical principles about the relationship between individual achievement and collective support that challenged common assumptions about heroism, self-reliance, and the proper balance between personal glory and communal welfare. The White Phantom assistance that became available through the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant created opportunities for souls to experience forms of cooperation and mutual aid that transcended ordinary considerations of personal benefit or strategic advantage. When a Covenant member answered a call for assistance, they were participating in a form of altruistic action that provided benefits to others without offering any corresponding material reward or advancement in their own individual journey through Lordran's challenges. The invasion mechanics that enabled hostile interaction between souls affiliated with opposing covenants served purposes that extended beyond simple player versus player combat or competitive challenge. These systems created opportunities for philosophical and practical conflicts to be resolved through direct confrontation rather than abstract debate, allowing different approaches to spiritual development and moral commitment to be tested against each other in circumstances where the stakes were meaningful and the outcomes had lasting consequences. The Red Phantom invasions that characterized Darkwraith Covenant activity were not random acts of griefing or casual violence, but rather ideologically motivated interventions designed to accelerate the cosmic transformation that Kathy's followers believed was necessary for humanity's ultimate liberation from divine oppression. Each successful invasion and humanity extraction contributed to the accumulation of spiritual resources that would eventually enable the coming of the Age of Dark and the fulfillment of humanity's true potential. The blue phantom justice that Dark Moonblade Covenant members delivered to souls who had been marked as sinners represented a different form of ideologically motivated intervention, one that sought to maintain moral order and social stability through deterrent punishment rather than revolutionary transformation. These interventions served to demonstrate that actions had consequences and that violations of trust and community standards would not be permitted to go unchallenged or unpunished. The forest invasion mechanics that enabled Forest Hunter Covenant members to defend their sacred groves against trespassers created opportunities for souls to experience the responsibility and burden that came with serving as guardians of Dennis, irreplaceable knowledge and spiritual resources. These invasions were not motivated by personal animosity or competitive desire for victory, but rather by recognition that some places and some wisdom were too precious to be exposed to casual exploitation or thoughtless destruction. The humanity cost that accompanied most forms of covenant interaction and cooperative activity reflected the recognition that meaningful, spiritual development required genuine sacrifice and personal investment rather than casual participation or superficial commitment. The souls who chose to kindle their humanity in order to access cooperative assistance or invasion mechanics were demonstrating their willingness to risk the very essence of their consciousness in pursuit of goals that extended beyond immediate personal safety or comfort. The Ember restoration and weapon enhancement systems that became available through various Covenant rewards created opportunities for souls to develop specialized capabilities that reflected their chosen spiritual disciplines and philosophical commitments. The divine weapons that could be created through Way of White Covenant service carried within their blessed steel the capacity to permanently destroy undead beings, reflecting the Covenant's fundamental belief that the curse of undeath represented a spiritual disease that required aggressive treatment rather than acceptance or accommodation. The occult weapons that served as counterparts to divine enhancement offered the ability to inflict particularly devastating damage upon the gods themselves, revealing the deep connections between religious authority and political power that characterized Lordran's spiritual landscape. The availability of both types of enhancement through related Covenant services demonstrated that the same institutional frameworks could serve radically different purposes depending upon the intentions and commitments of individual practitioners. The ultimate legacy of the Covenant system lay not in any particular rewards or achievements that individual souls might accumulate through their service and dedication, but rather in the creation of communities of practice and mutual support that could sustain meaningful spiritual development across the long periods of struggle and uncertainty that characterized existence in a dying world. The bonds forged through shared service and common commitment provided sources of meaning and purpose that could endure even when individual hopes for personal achievement or cosmic transformation proved illusory or unattainable. In the end, the items, ranks, and rewards that characterized Covenant membership served as external manifestations of internal transformations that could only occur through genuine commitment to purposes larger than individual welfare or personal satisfaction. Whether through the accumulation of humanity for service to suffering souls, the development of combat techniques for defense of sacred knowledge, or the cultivation of spiritual disciplines that transcended ordinary consciousness, the Covenant system provided frameworks within which individual souls could discover forms of meaning and connection that remained available even when traditional sources of hope and purpose had been corrupted or destroyed. In the profound depths of moral philosophy that lay at the very heart of Lordran's Covenant system, where the simple act of choosing one spiritual discipline over another revealed fundamental truths about the nature of consciousness, free will, and the eternal struggle between individual agency and cosmic determinism, there existed questions so complex and far-reaching that they challenged every comfortable assumption about heroism, villainy, and the proper relationship between personal desire and universal responsibility. The choice of Covenant membership was never merely a tactical decision about which benefits and rewards might best serve immediate survival needs or long-term strategic objectives, but rather a profound declaration of philosophical allegiance that shaped not only how individual souls would interact with the world around them, but also how they understood their own identity and purpose within the vast tapestry of existence that connected all conscious beings across time and space. The apparent freedom that every undead soul possessed to affiliate with any covenant that would accept their service, to abandon previous commitments in favor of new allegiances, or to remain entirely independent of all institutional frameworks and spiritual disciplines, represented one of the most sophisticated explorations of the relationship between choice and destiny that had ever been embedded within the structure of reality itself. Yet this freedom was simultaneously real and illusory, meaningful and constrained, transformative and limiting, in ways that revealed the fundamental paradoxes that characterized all attempts by conscious beings to assert control over their own spiritual development and moral evolution. The undead who emerged from the Northern Undead Asylum and began their journey through Lordran's treacherous landscapes carried within their hollow consciousness not only the capacity to choose from among the various covenants that would present themselves during their adventures, but also the accumulated weight of countless previous choices and experiences that had shaped their character and worldview in ways that made certain options more appealing or accessible than others. The knight who had spent lifetimes perfecting combat techniques and developing protective instincts toward innocent souls would naturally gravitate toward covenants that emphasized cooperation and mutual aid, while the scholar who had dedicated existence to the pursuit of forbidden knowledge would find attraction in disciplines that promised access to mysteries beyond conventional understanding. Yet this apparent predisposition towards certain forms of spiritual commitment did not represent simple mechanical determinism or the absence of genuine choice, but rather the complex interplay between individual nature and conscious decision-making that characterized all meaningful moral development. The warrior who chose to join the Warriors of Sunlight was not merely following inevitable programming or succumbing to predetermined destiny, but rather making a conscious decision to embrace and develop certain aspects of their identity while suppressing or transforming others that might lead toward different forms of spiritual evolution. The moral ambiguity that characterized every available covenant option reflected deep truths about the nature of ethical decision-making in circumstances where all available choices carried significant moral costs and uncertain outcomes. The Way of White's emphasis on hunting and destroying undead beings served noble purposes of protecting innocent souls from corruption and maintaining social order, yet it also required practitioners to commit acts of violence against conscious beings who might not have chosen their cursed condition and who retained the capacity for growth and redemption despite their transformation. The Warriors of Sunlight's philosophy of cooperation and mutual aid created opportunities for souls to experience forms of genuine altruism and collective achievement that transcended selfish concerns. Yet it also established systems of dependency and hierarchy that could prevent weaker souls from developing the individual strength and spiritual resilience necessary for long-term survival and moral development. The jolly cooperation that Solaire praised so enthusiastically was undeniably beneficial for those who received assistance, but it could also become a form of spiritual welfare that discouraged the kind of personal struggle and individual achievement that seemed necessary for genuine heroic development. The Blade of the Dark Moon's pursuit of justice and punishment for those who violated sacred trusts served important functions in maintaining moral order and deterring predatory behavior. Yet it also created systems of surveillance and retribution that could easily be abused by those who possessed the power to determine guilt and innocence, according to standards that were never fully transparent or democratically accountable. The Blue Phantoms who materialized to punish sinners were themselves engaging in acts of violence and invasion that differed from ordinary crimes, primarily in their supernatural authorization rather than their practical effects upon their crimes' victims. The Dark Wraith Covenant's revolutionary philosophy offered genuine insights into the corruption and hypocrisy that characterized established religious and political institutions. Yet its methods of achieving cosmic transformation required practitioners to engage in forms of spiritual predation and systematic violence that were difficult to distinguish from the oppression it claimed to oppose. The humanity extraction that formed the core of Dark Wraith practice involved the literal consumption of other souls' capacity for choice and growth, making Covenant members complicit in the very forms of exploitation and dehumanization they theoretically sought to eliminate. The Chaos Servant Covenant's emphasis on compassion and service to suffering souls represented some of the noblest impulses that conscious beings could experience. Yet, it also required practitioners to participate in systems of resource extraction and competitive violence that caused suffering to other souls who were equally deserving of compassion and equally in need of assistance. The humanity that could alleviate the fair lady's constant agony had to come from somewhere, and the methods available for gathering sufficient quantities inevitably involved forms of harm and exploitation that complicated simple moral calculations about service and sacrifice. The Forest Hunter Covenant's dedication to protecting ancient wisdom and sacred sites from exploitation and destruction served crucial functions in preserving knowledge and spiritual resources that could benefit future generations. Yet it also required members to commit acts of violence against souls who might not fully understand the significance of what they were threatening, and who might be seeking access to such resources for noble purposes of their own. The invasive red phantoms who appeared to defend Darkroot Garden were themselves violating the sanctuary and autonomy of other worlds in service of their protective mission. The Gravelord Servant Covenant's embrace of death as a natural and inevitable aspect of existence offered important correctives to the denial and fear that characterized many souls' relationship with mortality. Yet, its methods of spreading enhanced mortality throughout multiple worlds simultaneously involved forms of unwanted intervention and forced confrontation that violated principles of consent and individual autonomy that most moral frameworks would consider fundamental to ethical action. The path of the dragon's promise of transcendence beyond all forms of vulnerability and limitation represented the ultimate fulfillment of consciousness, seeking to escape the suffering and uncertainty that characterized temporal existence. Yet it also required practitioners to surrender everything that made individual consciousness valuable and meaningful in the first place. The stone-scaled immortality that served as the Covenant's ultimate goal was simultaneously the greatest possible achievement and the most profound form of spiritual suicide that any soul could choose. These moral ambiguities were not flaws or oversights in the Covenant system's design, but rather accurate reflections of the fundamental complexity that characterized all attempts by conscious beings to create institutions and practices that could serve multiple conflicting values. Simultaneously, the Covenant choices that souls faced in Lordran were difficult precisely because they mirrored the kinds of impossible moral dilemmas that characterized existence in any world where conscious beings possessed the freedom to choose between competing goods and competing evils without access to perfect information or guaranteed outcomes. The different responses to despair and meaninglessness that the various covenants represented reflected the full spectrum of philosophical and psychological strategies that conscious beings had developed for coping with existential uncertainty and cosmic indifference. The warriors of sunlight chose to combat despair through community and mutual aid, creating networks of support and cooperation that could sustain hope even when individual circumstances seemed hopeless. The Dark Wraiths chose to combat meaninglessness through revolutionary action and cosmic transformation, seeking to overthrow the systems that created suffering rather than simply finding ways to endure it with greater dignity or lesser pain. The Dragon Covenant members chose to combat both despair and meaninglessness through transcendence and escape, seeking to achieve states of existence that were beyond the reach of all forms of suffering and uncertainty, rather than finding ways to give meaning to such experiences. The Chaos Servants chose to combat despair through service and compassion, dedicating their existence to alleviating others' suffering even when such service required personal sacrifice and moral compromise. The search for meaning in a dying world that characterized all Covenant philosophy reflected deeper truths about the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic purpose that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Lordran's spiritual crisis. The undead who sought Covenant membership were confronting the same fundamental questions about purpose and value that faced any conscious being who possessed sufficient self-awareness to recognize their own mortality and the ultimate futility of most individual achievements when measured against cosmic timescales and universal entropy. The community versus isolation themes that ran through all Covenant philosophy reflected competing insights about whether conscious beings could find more meaning and satisfaction through connection with others who shared their struggles and aspirations, or through individual development of capabilities and perspectives that could transcend the need for external validation and support. The Warriors of Sunlight and Chaos Servants chose community and connection, accepting the vulnerabilities and dependencies that such choices entailed in exchange for the warmth and purpose that could be found in service to others. The Dragon Covenant and certain interpretations of the Gravelord philosophy chose isolation and individual transcendence, accepting the loneliness and detachment that such choices required in exchange for the autonomy and invulnerability that could be achieved through complete self-reliance and emotional independence. The Dark Wraiths and Forest Hunters occupied middle positions that combined elements of both approaches, maintaining connections with like-minded souls while developing individual capabilities that could function independently when community support was unavailable or insufficient. The price of power and belonging that characterized all Covenant membership reflected accurate understanding of the fundamental economic principles that govern spiritual development and moral evolution. No covenant offered benefits without corresponding costs. No spiritual discipline provided advantages without requiring sacrifices. And no form of community membership could be maintained without ongoing contributions of time, energy, and personal resources that limited practitioners' ability to pursue alternative forms of development or commitment. The humanity costs that accompanied most Covenant activities served as particularly clear examples of these spiritual economic principles in operation. The essence that souls offered to sustain Covenant benefits and access cooperative assistance was not simply another form of magical energy or tradable commodity, but rather the very substance of their capacity for choice, growth, and meaningful relationship with others. Every use of such spiritual currency represented a genuine sacrifice of future possibilities and alternative paths of development. The sin accumulation that resulted from Covenant betrayal or abandonment served similar economic functions, creating consequences that extended far beyond simple loss of accumulated benefits to encompass fundamental alterations in the soul's spiritual credit rating and moral reputation. The cosmic forces that governed Covenant mechanics maintained careful accounting of individual reliability and commitment, ensuring that those who had demonstrated capacity for betrayal would find it more difficult to gain access to forms of trust and cooperation that required genuine faith in others' integrity and dedication. Covenant switching as a narrative device reflected sophisticated understanding of how real spiritual development actually occurred in practice rather than in theory. Individual souls did not typically commit to single spiritual disciplines for entire lifetimes without experiencing doubts, conflicts, or evolving interests that led them to explore alternative approaches to meaning and transcendence. The ability to move between different covenants allowed for realistic portrayal of the complex journeys that characterized most serious attempts at moral and spiritual growth. Yet this freedom to explore different forms of commitment and community was balanced by meaningful consequences that prevented such exploration from becoming casual or superficial. The souls who chose to abandon previous covenant commitments faced not only material penalties in terms of lost benefits and accumulated progress, but also moral consequences that reflected the damage done to trust and community cohesion through acts of abandonment and betrayal. The progression through different covenant affiliations that many souls experienced during their journeys through Lordran often reflected deeper processes of spiritual maturation and moral development that could not be achieved through sustained commitment to any single discipline or community. The undead who began their adventures by joining the Way of White in search of clear moral guidance and institutional support might eventually discover that their growing understanding of cosmic complexity required transition to more sophisticated forms of spiritual practice that could accommodate ambiguity and uncertainty. The souls who initially embraced the revolutionary certainty of the Darkwraith Covenant might eventually recognize that their methods were creating forms of harm and exploitation that contradicted their original motivations for opposing established systems of oppression and control. Their transition to more moderate forms of spiritual practice might represent not moral failure or lack of commitment, but rather the kind of wisdom and self-awareness that could only be developed through direct experience of the unintended consequences that accompanied even well-intentioned attempts at cosmic transformation. The ultimate philosophical legacy of the Covenant choice system lay not in any particular path or discipline that individual souls might select, but rather in the creation of opportunities for conscious beings to explore different approaches to the fundamental questions of existence while experiencing meaningful consequences for their choices. The system demonstrated that individual agency remained significant even in circumstances where all available options were morally ambiguous and practically limited, and that the courage to make choices and accept their consequences represented one of the highest expressions of consciousness itself. The recognition that every covenant served both noble and questionable purposes, that every spiritual discipline offered both genuine benefits and significant costs, and that every form of community and commitment created both opportunities and limitations, reflected mature understanding of the complexity that characterized all serious moral reasoning and spiritual development. The undead who successfully navigated these choices did not achieve perfect moral clarity or complete spiritual satisfaction, but they did demonstrate the capacity for growth, learning, and adaptation that represented the best possible response to existential uncertainty and cosmic indifference. In the end, the philosophy of covenant choice served as a profound meditation on the nature of individual responsibility and collective purpose in circumstances where traditional sources of meaning and guidance had been corrupted or destroyed. The choices that souls made between competing goods and competing evils revealed their deepest values and highest aspirations, while simultaneously testing their capacity for courage, wisdom, and moral imagination in the face of impossible circumstances and uncertain outcomes. Whether through cooperation or isolation, revolution or transcendence, service or self-development, the Covenant system provided frameworks within which individual consciousness could continue to seek meaning and purpose, even when the foundations of reality itself seemed to be crumbling beneath their feet. In the deepest philosophical implications of Covenant interaction, and the metaphysical mechanics that governed the relationship between individual souls across the vast distances and dimensional barriers that separated their respective worlds, there existed forms of communication and connection that transcended ordinary understanding of space, time, and individual identity to create a complex web of spiritual exchange that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness, community, and moral responsibility in a universe where the boundaries between self and other had become fluid and permeable through the mysterious workings of the undead curse and the covenant bonds that sought to give meaning and purpose to existence beyond the reach of conventional morality or traditional social institutions. The invasion mechanics that allowed souls affiliated with opposing covenants to enter each other's worlds and engage in direct combat were not merely gameplay features designed to create competitive challenges or opportunities for player versus player interaction, but rather profound metaphysical systems that embodied entire philosophical frameworks about the relationship between individual agency and collective responsibility, personal freedom and cosmic justice that had been developed by the greatest minds in Lordran's history and embedded within the very structure of reality itself through magical techniques so sophisticated and far-reaching that their full implications remained hidden even from most of those who participated in their operations. When a red phantom materialized in an invaded world, carrying within their crimson essence the accumulated malice and predatory intent of whatever covenant had sponsored their transgression into another soul's private domain, they were not simply appearing as an unexpected obstacle or source of additional difficulty for someone who had been attempting to navigate Lordran's challenges in solitude or with carefully selected companions. Instead, they were serving as conscious agents of cosmic forces that operated according to principles of moral cause and effect, spiritual consequence, and karmic balance that extended far beyond immediate practical considerations to encompass vast patterns of meaning and justice that spanned multiple lifetimes and entire cycles of cosmic transformation. The Dark Wraith invasions that brought agents of humanity's supposed liberation into worlds where other souls were struggling with their own spiritual development and moral evolution represented more than simple acts of predation or resource extraction, disguised as ideological commitment. These red phantoms carried within their invasive presence the entire weight of Kathy's revolutionary philosophy and the accumulated resentment of countless souls who had concluded that the existing cosmic order was so thoroughly corrupted that working within its established rules and procedures would never produce meaningful change or genuine justice for those who suffered under divine oppression and institutional exploitation. Yet the practical experience of being invaded by such philosophically motivated aggressors revealed the complex moral contradictions that characterized all attempts to achieve cosmic transformation through individual acts of violence and spiritual predation. The souls who found themselves suddenly confronted by red phantoms seeking to extract their precious humanity were rarely given opportunities to engage in meaningful dialogue about the theoretical justifications for such intervention, nor were they consulted about whether they wished to contribute their essential spiritual resources to the revolutionary cause that supposedly justified their victimization. The humanity extraction that served as the ultimate goal of most Darkwraith invasions represented one of the most profound forms of spiritual violation that could be committed by one conscious being against another, involving not merely the theft of valuable resources or the infliction of temporary harm, but rather the literal consumption of another soul's capacity for choice, growth, and meaningful relationship with the world around them. The victims of such extraction emerge from their encounters, diminished in ways that went far beyond simple material loss to encompass fundamental alterations in their spiritual essence and moral capabilities. The red sign soapstone that enabled more honorable forms of combat between souls who sought to test their skills and resolve against worthy opponents represented a different approach to interworld conflict that acknowledged the moral complexity of voluntary versus involuntary confrontation, while still providing opportunities for ideological differences to be resolved through direct physical contest rather than abstract philosophical debate. The souls who placed red summon signs, and those who chose to activate them, were engaging in forms of ritualized combat that carried genuine stakes and meaningful consequences, while respecting principles of consent and mutual agreement that distinguish such encounters from acts of unprovoked aggression or predatory invasion. These honorable duels served functions that extended far beyond simple entertainment or skill development to encompass important forms of moral education and spiritual testing that could not be achieved through any other means. When two souls committed to opposing covenant philosophies faced each other in single combat under mutually agreed conditions, they were not merely determining who possessed superior fighting techniques or tactical capabilities, but rather allowing their fundamental approaches to existence and moral commitment to be evaluated through the kind of direct practical testing that revealed truths about character and conviction that no amount of theoretical discussion could provide. The forest invasion mechanics that enabled members of the Forest Hunter Covenant to defend their sacred groves against trespassers created opportunities for souls to experience the moral complexity that accompanied all attempts to protect valuable resources or preserve important knowledge from exploitation or destruction by those who might not understand their significance or respect their irreplaceable nature. These invasions were not motivated by personal animosity or competitive desire for victory, but rather by recognition that some places and some wisdom were too precious to be exposed to casual exploitation or thoughtless destruction by every undead wanderer who happened to stumble across them during their travels. Yet the practical implementation of this protective philosophy required forest hunters to commit acts of violence against souls who might be seeking access to ancient knowledge for noble purposes of their own, who might be desperately in need of the resources that could be found within the protected areas, or who might simply be unaware of the sacred nature of the territories they had entered without malicious intent or disrespectful attitude. The Red Phantoms who materialized to challenge forest intruders were forced to make instant judgments about the intentions and worthiness of their targets without access to the kind of detailed information about individual circumstances and motivations that would be necessary for truly just decision-making. The Dark Moon justice system that enabled Blue Phantoms to track and punish souls whose names had been entered in the Book of the Guilty represented perhaps the most sophisticated attempt to create supernatural mechanisms for maintaining moral order and deterring antisocial behavior that had ever been implemented within the structure of reality itself. The Covenant members who answered calls to deliver divine punishment were not acting as vigilantes or pursuing personal vendettas, but rather serving as conscious agents of cosmic justice who had been specifically selected and trained to carry out interventions that were supposedly based upon careful evaluation of evidence and systematic application of moral principles. Yet the practical operation of this justice system revealed many of the same problems that plagued all attempts to create fair and effective mechanisms for determining guilt and innocence. assigning appropriate punishment, and preventing the abuse of authority by those entrusted with judicial power. The blue phantoms who materialized to punish sinners had access to limited information about the specific circumstances that had led to their target's inclusion in the Book of the Guilty, and their interventions were necessarily based upon simplified categories of guilt and punishment that could not accommodate the full complexity of individual moral situations. The humanity cost that accompanied most forms of covenant interaction and cooperative activity created economic incentives and spiritual pressures that influenced the behavior of all participants in ways that complicated simple moral calculations about altruism, mutual aid, and service to others. The souls who chose to kindle their humanity in order to access cooperative assistance or invasion mechanics were making genuine sacrifices of their most precious spiritual resources, but they were also creating market conditions that encouraged certain forms of predatory behavior and resource extraction by other souls who had learned to profit from others' needs and vulnerabilities. The white phantom assistance that became available through cooperative covenants provided genuine benefits to souls who were struggling with challenges that exceeded their individual capabilities, but it also created dependency relationships that could prevent weaker souls from developing the personal strength and spiritual resilience that seemed necessary for long-term survival and moral development in Lordran's hostile environment. The jolly cooperation that Solaire praised so enthusiastically was undeniably beneficial in immediate practical terms, but its long-term effects upon individual character development and spiritual evolution were more ambiguous and potentially problematic. The online interaction systems that enabled souls from different worlds to communicate and cooperate across vast distances and dimensional barriers represented more than simply convenient mechanisms for accessing assistance or engaging in competitive challenges. These systems embodied sophisticated understanding of how consciousness could transcend the apparent limitations of individual physical existence to participate in forms of community and shared purpose that operated according to principles that challenged conventional assumptions about identity, agency, and moral responsibility. When a soul successfully summoned assistance from another world and worked together with their phantom companion to overcome obstacles that would have been impossible to handle alone, they were experiencing forms of cooperation and mutual aid that demonstrated the potential for conscious beings to achieve collective accomplishments that transcended the limitations of individual capability and perspective. These collaborative achievements served as proof that isolation and competition were not the only possible responses to existential challenges, and that meaningful forms of community and shared purpose could be maintained even in circumstances where traditional social institutions had collapsed or become corrupted. Yet the phantom nature of these interactions also highlighted the fundamental loneliness and isolation that characterized undead existence, as the companions who provided such valuable assistance would inevitably fade away when their immediate mission was completed, leaving their partners to continue their journeys in solitude with only memories of temporary connection and shared achievement to sustain them through subsequent trials and tribulations. The relationships formed through phantom interaction were simultaneously more profound and more ephemeral than ordinary social bonds, creating experiences of intimacy and mutual dependence that could not be sustained beyond specific moments of crisis and shared danger. The phantom system's metaphysical implications extended far beyond its immediate practical applications to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of identity and individual existence in a universe where consciousness could be shared, transferred, or temporarily merged through supernatural mechanisms that operated according to principles that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between self and other. When souls worked together as host and phantom, They were not simply cooperating as separate individuals who happened to share common goals, but rather participating in forms of collective consciousness and shared agency that blurred the distinctions between individual will and group decision-making. The invasion mechanics that enabled hostile interaction between souls from different worlds created opportunities for ideological conflicts and moral disagreements to be resolved through direct confrontation rather than abstract, theoretical debate. But they also raised profound questions about the proper limits of individual autonomy and the circumstances under which one conscious being could legitimately interfere in another's private sphere of activity and decision-making. The Red Phantoms who materialized in invaded worlds were asserting forms of moral authority and cosmic jurisdiction that challenged traditional concepts of sovereignty, consent, and individual rights to privacy and self-determination. The sin and absolution systems that governed much of the Covenant interaction mechanics reflected sophisticated understanding of how moral accountability and social order could be maintained in circumstances where traditional legal, institutions, and community oversight mechanisms had been destroyed or rendered ineffective by the breakdown of normal social relationships and political authority. The Book of the Guilty served not merely as a record of individual transgressions, but as a comprehensive catalogue of the ways in which conscious beings could violate the trust and cooperation that made any form of civilized existence possible. Yet, the criteria for inclusion in the book remained deliberately mysterious and potentially arbitrary, reflecting both the practical difficulties of gathering accurate information about complex moral situations and the deeper philosophical challenges involved in determining which actions truly deserved supernatural intervention versus those that could be adequately addressed through ordinary human responses. The souls whose names appeared in the book might be guilty of serious violations of trust and community standards, or they might be victims of false accusations, misunderstandings, or systematic biases that characterize the information gathering and decision-making processes that govern their inclusion. The absolution services that enabled souls to escape the consequences of their past actions through combinations of repentance, restitution, and payment of substantial fees represented attempts to create mechanisms for rehabilitation and redemption that could address both the practical harm caused by antisocial behavior and the underlying attitudes and choices that had made Suchbehavior possible. Yet, the cost of such absolution was deliberately substantial enough to ensure that the process represented genuine transformation rather than mere expedient escape from unpleasant consequences, creating economic barriers that might prevent some souls from accessing forgiveness and rehabilitation regardless of their sincere desire for moral improvement. The covenant-switching mechanics that enabled souls to move between different spiritual disciplines and philosophical commitments reflected realistic understanding of how actual moral development occurred in practice, as individual consciousness evolved through exposure to new ideas, experiences, and relationships that challenged previous assumptions and opened possibilities for alternative approaches to meaning and purpose. Yet the penalties associated with covenant abandonment ensured that such transitions carried meaningful consequences that prevented exploration of different spiritual paths from becoming casual or superficial. The ultimate philosophical legacy of the covenant interaction systems lay not in their immediate practical effects or specific mechanical implementations, but rather in their contribution to the ongoing conversation about how conscious beings ought to relate to one another in circumstances where traditional sources of moral guidance and social order had been corrupted or destroyed. The invasion and cooperation mechanics demonstrated that meaningful forms of community and shared purpose could be maintained even when individual souls were separated by vast distances and dimensional barriers, while the sin and punishment systems illustrated both the necessity and the difficulty of maintaining moral accountability in circumstances where conventional legal and social institutions were unavailable. The online components of the Covenant system served as extended explorations of fundamental questions about individual agency and collective responsibility, personal freedom, and social obligation that had relevance far beyond the specific fictional context of Lordran's spiritual crisis. The souls who participated in these interactions were confronting the same basic challenges that faced any conscious being who sought to maintain moral integrity and meaningful relationships in circumstances where the rules of engagement were unclear. The stakes were high, and the consequences of both action and inaction carried profound implications for individual character development and collective welfare. In the end, the Covenant interaction mechanics served as sophisticated philosophical instruments that enabled conscious beings to explore different approaches to the fundamental problems of existence while experiencing meaningful consequences for their choices and learning from direct practical engagement with alternative moral frameworks and spiritual disciplines, whether through cooperation or conflict, assistance or invasion, punishment or absolution. These systems provided opportunities for souls to test their convictions, develop their capabilities, and deepen their understanding of the complex relationships between individual will and cosmic purpose that characterized all serious attempts to find meaning and direction in a universe that often seemed indifferent to conscious concerns and aspirations. And so we reach the end of our journey through the sacred bonds that define existence in Lordran's fading light. Each covenant represents a different path through despair. Some seek cooperation, others solitude. Some embrace the light, others court the dark. Yet, all share the common thread of souls seeking meaning in a world that has largely forgotten its purpose. The warriors of sunlight teach us that even in the darkest times, the warmth of fellowship can kindle hope where none existed before. Their golden phantoms appear not as conquering heroes but as gentle companions, offering assistance without expectation of reward or recognition. In Solaire's philosophy of jolly cooperation, we discover that the greatest victories are not those won through individual prowess, but through the careful harmony of diverse souls working toward shared purpose. The lightning that crackles from their raised palms carries within its divine energy the accumulated wisdom of a god who learned through exile that true strength comes not from domination, but from the capacity to inspire others to achieve their highest potential. The blade of the dark moon reminds us that mercy without justice becomes mere enablement of cruelty, that some violations of trust and community standards demand supernatural intervention when ordinary mechanisms of accountability have failed or been corrupted. Their pale blue light serves as both warning and promise. Warning to those who would exploit others' vulnerability for personal gain, promise to those who suffer that their pain has been witnessed and will not go unanswered. In Gwendolyn's covenant of divine retribution, we see reflected our own struggles with the balance between forgiveness and accountability, between understanding the circumstances that lead to moral failure and maintaining the boundaries that make civilized existence possible. The Way of White and Princess Guard reveal how even the noblest intentions can become corrupted when institutional power grows distant from the spiritual truths it claims to serve. Their tragedy lies not in deliberate evil, but in the gradual transformation of genuine faith into empty ritual, authentic service into bureaucratic self-preservation. Princess Guinevere's illusory beauty serves as both blessing and curse. Blessing for those who need hope to sustain them through dark times. Curse for those whose devotion becomes trapped within structures that can no longer provide the spiritual nourishment they promise. The forest hunters show us that some knowledge and some places are too precious to be left unguarded, that the price of preserving ancient wisdom sometimes requires those who would protect it to become obstacles to those who would access it. Alvina's cat's eyes see through centuries of accumulated understanding about the relationship between curiosity and wisdom, access and preservation. Their red phantom interventions serve not as acts of random hostility, but as examinations, testing whether those who seek the forest's secrets possess the strength and character necessary to safely receive what they pursue. The Chaos Servants embody both the nobility and the tragedy of unlimited compassion, showing us souls who have chosen to serve love, even when love demands actions that compromise their own moral clarity. The fair lady's suffering becomes a mirror in which we see reflected all the impossible choices that face conscious beings who must decide between competing goods and competing evils, without access to perfect information or guaranteed outcomes. Kirk's devotion transforms him into exactly the kind of predator he might once have fought against. Yet his motivation remains pure, even as his methods become indistinguishable from those of common criminals. The Dark Wraiths offer revolutionary wisdom wrapped in methods that replicate the very oppression they claim to oppose. Kathy's alternative history challenges comfortable assumptions about divine authority and cosmic justice, yet the humanity extraction that forms the core of Dark Wraith practice reveals how easily noble goals can be corrupted by ignoble means. Their red phantoms carry, within their invasive presence, both genuine insights about systemic corruption and the kind of predatory behavior that makes such corruption seem justified to those who benefit from existing power structures. The Path of the Dragon represents the ultimate philosophical question about the value of consciousness itself, whether the highest possible achievement is the transcendence of all individual characteristics and personal investments, or whether such transcendence represents merely the most elaborate form of spiritual suicide ever devised. The stone scales that promise eternal invulnerability also threaten to transform their wearers into beings so removed from ordinary concerns that they become indistinguishable from natural features of the landscape. The Gravelord's servants remind us that death is not the opposite of life, but rather its necessary complement, the force that gives meaning and urgency to all forms of creative activity and conscious choice. Nito's covenant teaches acceptance of mortality not as fatalistic resignation, but as recognition that endings make beginnings significant, that the possibility of loss gives weight to achievement, that the prospect of separation makes connection precious. Their sword dance spreads enhanced mortality, not as punishment, but as education about the true nature of existence in a universe where all forms of being are temporary. Through the Book of the Guilty and its systems of supernatural justice, we encounter the eternal challenges of maintaining moral accountability in circumstances where traditional institutions have failed or been corrupted. Oswald's absolution services demonstrate that redemption remains possible, even for those who have committed serious violations of trust and community standards. Yet the cost of such forgiveness must be substantial enough to represent genuine transformation, rather than mere expedient escape from unpleasant consequences. The Covenant interaction systems reveal how individual choices ripple outward to create vast networks of consequence and connection that span multiple worlds and countless souls. The invasion mechanics serve not merely as competitive challenges, but as philosophical laboratories, where different approaches to moral reasoning can be tested through direct practical engagement, rather than abstract theoretical debate. The cooperation systems demonstrate that meaningful forms of community can be maintained even when individual souls are separated by vast distances and dimensional barriers. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself imagine not the conflicts we have witnessed, but the connections that endure beyond them. Picture souls from different covenants discovering their common ground, their shared struggles with impossible choices and uncertain outcomes. Dream of Solaire's warm laughter reaching across ideological divides, to embrace even those who serve opposing causes, of the fair lady's compassion, extending to comfort those who have harmed others in service of what they believe to be greater goods. Rest now in the knowledge that even in the darkest nights, when hope seems nothing more than a distant memory, and all paths appear to lead toward forms of compromise or corruption, the bonds we forge with others, whether through covenant membership, phantom assistance, or simple recognition of shared vulnerability, provide sources of meaning and purpose that transcend any particular outcome or achievement. The covenants of Lordran teach us that the search for perfect solutions to the fundamental problems of conscious existence is less important than the courage to keep searching, the wisdom to accept uncertainty without surrendering agency, and the love that sustains us through choices that have no ideal answers, but must still be made with full awareness of their consequences and complete commitment to whatever good can be preserved or created, even in circumstances that seem designed to make such preservation impossible. Close your eyes now and let these ancient stories carry you into peaceful slumber, knowing that like the chosen undead who walked these paths before you, you possess the capacity to forge meaning from chaos, to create connection across vast distances, and to maintain hope even when the flame grows dim and the darkness seems ready to reclaim everything that consciousness has built in its brief moment of illumination against the eternal night.